Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, sometimes things happen that lead you down a path you never envisaged or imagined for your life, and that was certainly the case with my family. For in my wildest dreams, I would never have envisaged emigrating to America, nor would I have ever comprehended the possibility of encountering the fictitious creature that is known as Bigfoot. Yet both these things happened to me, as the hands of fate, geographically, physically, spiritually and emotionally, were pulling me towards the northern hemisphere of the globe, like a magnet to a bag of iron filings, as possibly some things are just meant to be, and are clearly written in the stars. My name is Chloe, and my story really begins in 1992, when I was 10 years old at the time. It all began when my family moved to a stunning red brick and stone farmhouse in the Berkshire countryside that was over 300 years old. I remember my father was astonished that we were able to get this property for less than the asking price, which rarely ever happens, as old properties in this part of the world, with historical character, intrigue and charm, are almost always snapped up in a heartbeat. The previous residents were almost too eager to sell, which was astonishing, given that they'd only lived in the idyllic farmhouse for 18 months, and they had renovated the old stable block and barns to pristine mint condition. And after all that laborious back-breaking work, they had decided to sell, which was nonsensical. Why would anybody put all their blood, sweat and tears into a building design that involved upgrading the entire farm, only to abandon the finished project? Our estate agent, an evasive, rather guarded young woman called Julia Crawford, was very cagey with us, and she certainly wasn't forthcoming about giving us much information or details as to why the previous owners were selling. But she did infer that they had decided to move up to London. But why, we couldn't imagine. Despite Julia's impotent inability to be completely honest with us, we chose to not concern ourselves with such incongruous and anomalous oddities, but instead we put all our energy and focus into our stunning farmhouse that was as pretty as a picture, surrounded by emerald green pastures, ubiquitous trees, and lots of fabulous hiking trails. Our property was situated close to the town of Newbury, where my father ran a very successful antique business during the week, and on the weekends he thoroughly enjoyed riding his favourite horse Shoelace around the countryside. Shoelace was stabled on our farm in the brand new stable wing, along with 6 other horses that we owned. We settled into our fabulous new home and rural country life with a seamless ease and efficiency, but we did sense something was wrong from the very first day we moved in. It's hard to really describe the fraught feeling that overcame me personally, but I often sensed we weren't alone, and there were times I got the creepy sensation that something or someone was watching us. And then slowly but surely, strange things began to happen in and around our home. I remember the first hint that something was seriously off was when we were sitting at the dinner table eating a roast leg of beef with Yorkshire pudding and roast potatoes for our Sunday lunch. when all of a sudden the doorknob of the door in the dining room squeaked and turned, and then it slowly opened, all on its own accord, and then we heard heavy steel-rimmed boots walking past us with a very pronounced footfall, which went down the terracotta steps, through the living area, to the sliding door on the patio, and we physically saw that door sliding back all on its own, but there was nobody there. My parents and my aunt and uncle were at the table, including myself, of course, and we all stopped eating very suddenly, and there wasn't a face around the table that did not look disturbed and confounded. Another strange anomaly was that the room felt as cold as ice, and this happened when the summer temperatures outside were unusually high for that time of year. But I assure you, minutes after that experience, the room remained so cold and very airy, and every single one of us experienced chills down the spine and goosebumps on the skin. My mother's face had grown as white as a sheet, and she looked at us. "Did you see that?" she gasped. Everybody nodded quietly, but no one said a single word, and we ate our meal in silence, as I think we were so astonished by what we had seen and could not make any sense of what had just occurred, and the most cynical among us had no rational explanation for the bizarre phenomena, and I could see my aunt and uncle just could not wait to leave our farmhouse that afternoon, as they were so freaked out by the incident. 2 days later, I woke up to be greeted by chaos as my father entered the kitchen while my mother and I were eating toast with jam, washed down with large mugs of sweet tea. "What on earth is the matter with you?" my mother asked my father, viewing the bewildered expression on his face with a growing sense of trepidation. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "It is far worse than that," said my father. "A ghost I can deal with, but losing all our horses at once, especially my beloved shoelace, I cannot deal with that. I'm at a loss to know what on earth has happened to them all, as they've just vanished into thin air, and there is no sight or sound of them anywhere, and I've searched the entire farm." "You mean our horses have gone?" my mother asked, looking absolutely appalled. "Have they been stolen? I don't understand how that could have happened. We never heard any commotion during the night from the horses. What's going on?" "It beats me," said my father. "This is a monumental travesty as far as I'm concerned. Those horses are irreplaceable. I put all my energies into finding the finest thoroughbreds, and then this has to happen. It's nonsensical. I'm going to have to inform the police about this. I wonder if there's been a spate of horse robberies in the area of late." "That won't be necessary," came the crisp English accent of our neighbour, who had entered our kitchen. Lisa Hunter was a very slender horse lady in her early 50s, who was almost always wearing blue jodhpurs, riding boots, a white cotton shirt, and a tight-fitting blue jacket, for indeed I never saw her wearing anything else. We'd only recently met her at a polo match and warmed to her immediately, as she was very easygoing, relaxed and straightforward, and always inclined to speak her mind, which is very commonplace among the country folk here. "I'm so sorry to have to intrude," she said, "but I do have to inform you that last night all your horses were placed in my stable block, and mine were put out to graze in the meadows." "Let me get this right," said my father. "You're saying someone put your horses out to graze in the open meadows, and transported our horses from our stable blocks on our farm to yours overnight?" "That's right," she said. "I'm pleased to be able to tell you that your horses are doing absolutely fine, and are no worse for the experience. My stable hand will bring them over to your premises shortly, so you have nothing to worry about." "That's a relief," said my father. "Who would do such an outrageous, preposterous and absurd thing like this? Last night we never even heard so much as a dicky-bird from the horses." "It is very peculiar," she agreed. "In all my born days, I've never seen anything like this happen before. I'm left to conclude that someone is taking the mick, or having a laugh at our expense, as whoever is doing this clearly knows exactly what they're doing." "Like who?" said my father, looking perturbed. "Who would do such an insidious, disingenuous thing?" At this, Lisa looked rather awkward, and appeared somewhat contrived and incommodious, almost as if she was rather embarrassed about what she was about to tell us. "I think this is the artful work of an old stable hand I once employed over a year and a half ago. A very likeable, hard-working character, a young man called Eric, who loved working with my horses, but I had to let him go because he stole a couple of my saddles. I wasn't having that. I can't abide dishonesty of any kind." Of course, Eric apologised profusely and assured me that he'd never steal from me again. But by then the damage was done. I knew I could never trust him again. I'm big on the trust lark, I'm afraid. Anyway, when he left the premises with his tail between his legs, he told me, in no uncertain terms, that I would certainly live to regret the day that I ever let him go, and that he would get his revenge on me in one way or another. And I have to tell you, I could tell by his demeanour he meant every word of it. My father looked at Lisa with a befuddled, somewhat perplexed expression on his face. "But I don't understand," he said. "If this Eric left your employ a whole year and a half ago, why would he choose to take vengeance on you so late in the day? Would he not have taken retribution on you sooner?" "That is an excellent question," said Lisa. "I wish I knew the answer to that, but I'm afraid I don't. I am determined, though, to get to the bottom of this enigmatic situation, because I'm almost 100% certain that Eric is behind this perfidious prank. And so I will call around to his grandmother's cottage this afternoon, and I'll keep you posted as to what on earth is going on around here." "I would be most grateful, Lisa," said my father, "if you will keep us brief, that is." Later that evening, Lisa arrived on our front doorstep, telling us she had something quite shocking to share with us, which left us feeling more than a little discomposed. What on earth was she going to tell us, I wondered privately to myself. My father ushered her into our kitchen, and she sat down on one of the wooden chairs around our kitchen table, and gratefully grabbed a glass of cold Sauvignon Blanc that my father handed to her. I could see her fingers were trembling, and that even the wine in her glass wobbled precariously, as if it was about to spill everywhere, and my mother was watching her glass very warily, waiting on tenterhooks for an accident to occur, but it never transpired, as miraculously the wine remained in her glass. It would seem that normally the very pragmatic, prudent and unflappable woman seemed incredibly fretful. "Thanks," she said, taking several gulps of the wine gratefully. "Ah, that is so good. Oh, just what the doctor ordered. Oh, I've been looking forward to this all day. What an extraordinary day it's been." She looked at us with a solemn expression on her face. "Brace yourself, everybody, and get ready for the ride of your lives, because I have something to tell you that is so appalling that it's not for the faint-hearted, I'm afraid." "You're scaring me half to death," said my mother. "Tell us quickly, before I have a panic attack," she said, suddenly pouring herself a glass of wine. "Well, there's no easy way to say this," said Lisa, looking at us earnestly. "But I'm going to say it as it is, without any frills, and it's not going to be pretty, as sadly the cold, ugly truth never ever is. Eric, my old stable hand, is dead, and it has been brought to my attention that he hung himself here on your land, in your brand new stable block, about 3 months ago. The previous owners found him dangling from a rope on the rafters there." "Wait," said my father, stroking his moustache reflectively. "Am I hearing this right? Your ex-stable hand, Eric, hung himself in our stable block over 3 months ago, and the original owners of our property found his deceased body dangling by a rope from the rafters. Is that what you're saying?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, love," said Lisa. "There is no nice way to put any of this. You see, I went to see Eric's grandmother this afternoon. Oh, delightful woman she is, and as fit as a fiddle for a woman in her 80s, I might tell you. She lives in a cottage outside of Newbury. She raised Eric on her own since he was a toddler. The poor woman is so distraught to have lost her beloved grandson, but she did say that from day one he's always been a very troubled boy. I think being abandoned by your parents in favour of a drug addiction is likely to cause a great deal of angst and feelings of inadequacy, which might explain Eric's insecurities and some of the strange behaviours he exhibited. Of course, he lived and breathed horses. They helped him to forget about all his problems, but he did have a huge issue with thieving, as he was a kleptomaniac and just couldn't suppress the raging desire to pilferage what did not belong to him, which had become like an addiction. His grandmother told me he didn't even want half the stuff he stole, but a sense of compulsion would overcome him, and he just couldn't stop himself. This invariably meant that he kept losing jobs left, right and centre from all his employers. So I'm not the only person to have given him his marching orders. It would seem that the previous owners of this property had Eric as a stable hand, and his light fingers meant that he was dismissed from his job yet again. His grandmother believes that this was the final straw. The poor boy was so mortified to lose his job that he'd loved so much, especially because he was so attached to one of the horses in particular. He did threaten the employers who lived here by informing them he'd come back to wreak his revenge on them, much like he'd done with me. I gather when the owner discovered Eric lying there with a noose around his head deceased, he became distressed and really regretted sacking the boy. I believe he hadn't perceived what an anguished, tormented soul that Eric actually was, and how much he'd adored those horses and loved working with them. Of course, he couldn't come to terms with the fact that Eric had hung himself on his account, and was so aggrieved about the whole incident. I think that's why the family actually up and left and subsequently moved to London. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," said my mother. "What a dreadful, dreadful story. I can understand now why they were so eager to sell. No wonder that cagey estate agent was so guarded and non-committal when we questioned her about why the previous owners wanted to sell the place for less than the asking price. I must admit it did seem to be too good to be true at the time. I imagine she didn't want us to find out about Eric, as that would almost certainly have influenced our decision as to whether to buy this place or not. I think knowing someone has hung themselves on this land is not something you really want to live with on your conscience." "Which brings me to my very next question," said my father, looking grave. "Who on earth locked our horses in your stable block? If it wasn't Eric, he's dead. So who could it have been?" "That's just it," said Lisa. "I think it's Eric doing all these outlandish things from beyond the grave. I do believe he's toying with us. It wouldn't surprise me at all if his tormented, troubled soul is still hanging around the horses and refusing to cross over to the other side." "Don't be ridiculous," said my father. "Are you suggesting Eric's ghost moved our horses to the stables on your property? How is that even possible?" "You may think I'm completely balmy," said Lisa, "and I can't say that I blame you if you do. But I have been having incomprehensible, illogical and enigmatic things happening around our farm of late. Things that can't be explained, like saddles found lying on the sides of my bath, and horses let out into the fields when I definitely put them in the stable block. I've also heard strange footsteps and whispers when no one is there. So I assure you something paranormal is going on, and it is all making sense to me now. I know in my gut that Eric is responsible for all this absurd activity." "You think it's Eric's ghost haunting the land and causing all this chaos and discord?" asked my mother, looking dumbfounded. "I didn't even know ghosts could be so hands-on and physical." "I'm going to be contacting a psychic medium," said Lisa, "to clear away the negative energy, and a priest to bless the place in the circumstances. And I have to say, it would be wise for you to do the same. I will speak to you later," she said, getting up to leave. "I really am truly sorry to have offloaded this unwelcome news on your doorstep, but the truth needs to be told." Once Lisa had left our premises, both my parents had a hard time dealing with what they'd just learnt. They were beleaguered that our beautiful stable block had been the scene of a grisly hanging, and this disheartening revelation caused my father a great deal of persecution. So much so, in fact, that the very next day he contacted the estate agent to ask her why she hadn't told him the truth about Eric hanging himself in the stable block on our land. "But I told you all about that grievous incident, Mr. Carpenter. Don't you remember?" Julia had insisted. You never told me anything of the sort, Julia, my father piped. Why are you lying to me? Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Carpenter? That is defamation of character. I told you all about the hanging incident. I clearly remember doing so. You must have completely forgotten about it. But don't you dare go accusing me of lying, or I'll call up my lawyers and sue you. I assure you, Julia, that if I'd known about the hanging, I'm not convinced I would have bought this property, he said, slamming down the phone, looking more than a little rattled. What an infuriating, narcissistic woman, said my father. She's blatantly lying through her teeth and pretending she informed me about the hanging on our land, which she never did. All she can think about is the commission in her pocket. She's a greedy, greedy woman. Are you all right, Daddy? I asked. I could see that he seemed rather unhinged. I will be, once I've taken Shoelace for a ride. I just need some fresh air and exercise to get my head around all this dreadful stuff that, quite frankly, is doing my head in. I knew there was something about that stable block, something untoward, as the energy there has never been right, not from day one, and our horses have always seemed unsettled there. If you're going for a ride, sweetheart, said my mother, might I come with you, she said. I'll saddle up one of the other horses. A little fresh air is definitely needed after the shock we've both had. Little did I realise that this would be the last time that I would ever see my father alive. My mother was to later inform me that Shoelace, who is normally the most docile, mellow horse on the entire planet, became frantic when riding out in the meadows. It was like he sensed and felt something we could not see, and became frenzied and overwrought, and began to buck and rear up on his hind legs, falling backwards and crushing your father to death. And it happened so quickly. It would take a lifetime to describe to you the desolation, anguish, torment and despondency that my mother and I felt after my father's untimely demise, as he was our rock and anchor, the lighthouse or beacon, if you like, that guided us to safety through the turbulent, choppy currents of life. Now he was no longer there to put a plaster on my knee when I grazed myself, or to kiss it better, nor was he there to read me a bedtime story, or to make my favourite pancakes for breakfast. It was like a bright light had gone out in our lives, and there were times that my depression reached an all-time low, and I never believed I would ever be normal again. My mother wisely decided to sell the farm and move to a cottage in the Cotswolds, but she hired a psychic to clear the energy around our home, as she didn't want what had happened to my father to happen to any future owners of the land. The psychic was a rotund, short lady with beady hawk eyes, who wore her hair up in a bun and spoke in a very deep voice. I don't need to do anything here, she told us happily. It would seem that all the negative oppressive energy has been cleared and lifted. Your husband came to collect a ghost boy here on your land, a very troubled soul, recently departed, and now they're both at peace on the other side, and are very happy. That's wonderful, said my mother, mopping the tears away from her eyes. That is the sort of generous thing my husband would have done, she said. Could you ask him what he thinks caused his death? Your husband tells me to tell you that the horse-riding accident occurred because his horse perceived the presence of the ghost boy on the ride, and became very frantic, as horses are very sensitive to the supernatural. My mother looked appalled. Are you telling me that the ghost of Eric was responsible for my husband's death? It seems that even in death that kid was trouble. Nothing is ever as black and white as it seems, said the psychic. The universe, God, source if you like, does not work quite the way that you think it does. If something is meant to happen, it has to happen. And your husband was meant to leave the earth plane. It was his exit point, if you like, that he chose long before he was born. Your husband assures me that if it wasn't a riding accident, it would have been something else that would have taken him from this life, and he is insistent about this. He assures me that no one is to blame for his untimely death. He needs you to understand this fact. He also wants me to tell you that he loves you so much, and that you will meet someone, over the waters, and be very happy again. I'm sorry, said my mother, but that will never ever happen. There will never be anyone else. I could not replace Arthur. Fast forward to 1999, which was about 7 years after my father's unseasoned, tragic death. And although as a family we never came to terms with his loss, it would seem that the gift of time is a remarkable and very generous healer. And although the pain gets easier, you never ever forget. And I wouldn't want to either. I was about 17 years old when my mother and I were moving to the bluegrass state of Kentucky, as my mother had been swept off her feet by a rugged, very handsome American gentleman called Elijah Williams, whom she'd met on a cruise to the Caribbean. And 7 weeks after that romantic meeting, they had tied the knot with a very small wedding ceremony. I could see that my mother was exceedingly happy, and it was hardly surprising, because Elijah was the warmest, kindest man I had ever met. And for the first time in 7 years, there truly was a twinkle in my mother's eye, and a spring to her step. I know it's going to be hard, sweetheart, adapting to a brand new life in a new country, with everything so different, but I think you're a resilient girl, and change is not a bad thing. But all my friends are here, I protested. I don't know anybody in America. That will change, said my mother. I'm sure you will make friends. Elijah assures me that the southern hospitality in Kentucky is second to none, and people will make you feel very welcome there. My mother wasn't wrong, as North America welcomed me to her bosom with open arms like a maternal matriarch, and not for a moment did I feel out of place, but I was enveloped with a sense of belonging. The people in the quaint North American town were among the nicest, most convivial people that I have met in my entire life, and were eager to make my acquaintance and to befriend me. While Kentucky was so large and spacious compared to the English countryside where I'd grown up, it was indeed exquisitely beautiful, and I was mesmerized by the undulating green pastures, flowery meadows, V-shaped valleys, silvery lakes, and ubiquitous areas of natural forest, not to mention the indigenous wildlife, which was a delight to behold. Elijah lived on a sizable farm in a charming colonial-style farmhouse that had been in his family for over 3 generations, and although he grew corn on the land, he also ran his own workshop from a large shed on the premises that was like an Aladdin's cave of retrograde, obsolete treasures that had been rusted, corroded and tarnished by time, that he had fixed up and restored, like old cars, petrol pumps, signs, clocks, merry-go-rounds, popcorn machines and stuff like that. He was masterfully skilled with his hands, and could return a vintage treasure from the scrap heap back into its former glory. It was through Elijah's work that I met my boyfriend Charles Tyler, who was very eager to become Elijah's apprentice. For some reason, from the moment we met, we just connected, and in a trice we were spending all our spare time together, cycling down country lanes on our bicycles, riding horses, or exploring the forests in the area. As in all my born days, I have never been so beguiled and bedazzled by some of these shaded retreats or verdant sanctuaries with their tall, statuesque trees and exquisite fauna and flora. My story begins on an ordinary Saturday morning in early spring, when the weather was warm and sunny with a gentle breeze, and Charles and I decided that it was the quintessential day for a picnic, and so we cycled down some pretty country lanes in search of the perfect spot, which ended up being in a flowery meadow full of pretty yellow, white and purple daisies, cat's ears and bluegrass, with an arresting view over a fenced-in grazing pasture where bay and black Arabian horses were grazing. This prepossessing open meadow was fringed by the arresting white blossoms of the serviceberry trees, mixed with the pink blossoms of the dogwoods, along with oaks, maples and walnuts that spread out into an extensive expanse of wood green. I spread out the red and white checkered tablecloth onto the long grass, which we pressed down to create a flat platform. We opened up our Tupperware containers filled with delicious food, which included fried chicken, buttermilk biscuits, sweet potato pie, cornbread, barbecue potato chips, and egg and ham sandwiches, along with large bottles of peach iced tea. We were about to eat our picnic when we heard a strange scream that was so terrifying that it sounded like a woman was being murdered, and Charles and I were convinced that someone was in serious trouble and that a woman was being attacked in the woods. Charles frantically looked for something to use as a weapon and found a sizable piece of timber. "I'm going to see what's going on," he said. I think a woman is being assaulted in those trees. You stay over there." "Are you kidding me?" I said, searching for a long piece of timber myself to use as a makeshift weapon. "You can't leave me here alone. I'm coming too." Once again we heard the woman's frantic, terrified screams, and we were almost certain she was being brutally attacked. We could only hope we could get to her in time, but the sound was so piercing I was left feeling very certain we would find a dead body on our hands, as the scream sounded like the woman was literally dying. My heart was thundering through my chest like a heavy drum as we dashed through the wood green. But the trouble was that the screaming had stopped, and there was no sign of the mysterious woman anywhere, despite much intensive searching. "I don't think this is a woman in trouble," said Charles. "Maybe we heard some kind of animal, but what it was, I can't imagine." "Are you sure?" I asked. "It did sound like a woman. I'm wondering if these woods is haunted and the screams are paranormal. It is a possibility, you know." "Haunted," laughed Charles. "Where did you get that idea from?" "Come on," he said, taking my hand. "Let's go back to our picnic and finish what we started before we were so rudely interrupted by those screams." Imagine our amazement when we approached our picnic spot to see what looked like a huge black bear sitting on our picnic rug, with its massive back turned away from us. It appeared to be eating all our food, which was spread out decadently all over the tablecloth. "Oh my goodness," said Charles, "a black bear! That's all we need." He began to lift up a stone to throw at the creature. I stopped him in his tracks. "Charles, what on earth are you doing?" "I'm scaring the black bear away from our picnic spot," he assured me, throwing the stone at the creature. All of a sudden, the creature stood up on two powerful legs, towering at about 7 foot tall, and swivelling around to look directly at us. But this was no bear. What on earth was it? I was so astonished by what I was perceiving. Everything seemed so surreal that for a moment I was literally too flabbergasted to even be afraid. I could hear Charles say, "What the heck is that?" The creature was so human in appearance that it was uncanny. Granted, there were some ape-like aspects to his anatomy, which I discerned, most notably in the pyramid shape of the head, the overlong arms, and the powerful muscular density of the critter's framework. For this creature was literally built for speed, power, endurance, and strength, and its rock-hard body was solid and burly. To put it mildly, he was one of the most intimidating creatures I have ever beheld, and easily as awesome as an elephant, rhino, or even a lion. The creature did not look amused at being assaulted by a stone, and curled its lips back and began to scream at us. It was the very same terrifying murderous scream that had led us to believe that a woman was being attacked in the first place. I was so terrified that I began to shake and wobble like a jelly. And I was desperate to run away, but it was like I could not get my brain into gear to fire up any movement in my legs. I was as still as a car that simply refuses to start on a cold winter's morning, no matter how hard you press down on that accelerator. "Run! Run, Chloe! Run!" I heard Charles screaming at me. "Run, now!" I could feel the tears pouring down my cheeks, as this creature was so terrifying, but I was so incapacitated by fear, I was certain I was about to be attacked and killed violently by this beast. The next thing I knew was that Charles lifted me up into his arms and began to run with me. I could see the creature almost jogging behind us, and it was snarling, grunting, and screaming. Charles put me down when we reached our bicycles, and even to this day I have no idea how I managed to climb onto my bike seat and manoeuvre it down the country lane, but we both pedalled furiously down that road as fast as we possibly could, while this curious creature was literally jogging behind us, swinging its overlong arms backwards and forwards and throwing pebbles it picked up on the road at our bikes, and it continued to scream. Many of those pebbles hit our bicycles and nearly caused me on a couple of occasions to fall over, but luckily I didn't. I don't recall a time when I was more afraid, and when we got back to the house, I was trembling so much that it took several cups of sweet hot tea to bring me back to my senses. "What the hell happened to the two of you?" asked Elijah. "And why is Chloe shaking so much, Charles?" "We've just seen a monster." We proceeded to tell Elijah what had happened, and he was silent for a long moment, and then he spoke. "You would have been fine if you hadn't antagonized the creature by throwing a stone at it. You do realize that it was a foolish thing to do. It was like you were asking for trouble." "I was trying to shoo it away," said Charles. "I thought it was a bear." "Word to the wise," said Elijah. "Always make sure you know what you're dealing with before you begin to confront it." "You sound like you know what the kids saw, sweetheart," said my mother. "I believe they saw a wild man," said Elijah. "My grandfather told me about these beings once. They're usually benevolent, unless they're challenged." "This one was very aggressive," I assured Elijah, "and it was eating our picnic." "Chloe, if I threw a stone at you, how would you react?" asked Elijah. "Well, I'd run away, or I'd fight back," I said. "Well, don't you see, the creature fought back, because he thought he was being challenged." "Well, I hadn't actually thought of it like that," I admitted. Looking back all these years later, I know that Charles, who is now my husband, and I both encountered a Bigfoot, and I feel remarkably privileged to have seen the creature, although I wish the experience had been congenial. I do believe that if Charles had not been so ignorant as to throw a stone at the creature, our whole encounter with him could have been so different. But you can't live with regret. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Bernard, and my story begins in the 1990s when I was working for the United States Postal Service, where I would deliver post parcels and packages to a large area around the bluegrass state of rural Kentucky, using my postal carrier van as a means of transportation, as many of the country farmhouses where I dropped off post were acres apart. The only area where I walked on foot was around the quaint rural town, where the shops and apartments were built rather close together. As a result of my job, I was as fit as a fiddle, and certainly didn't require any gym membership, and it always felt good at the end of the long day to see my previously heavily packed carriage now emptied of everything, which always gave me a good feeling that I'd accomplished my goal for the day. I assure you, I thoroughly enjoyed my tranquil, relaxing drives through the spectacular, verdant, scenic vistas of rural Kentucky, which in itself was an uplifting experience for me. I would drive past gorgeous farms, pretty barns, silvery lakes, and fenced-in areas of emerald-green pastures with grazing horses, sheep or cows. I also loved watching the changing of the seasons from the windscreen of my vehicle, when the countryside was swathed in carpets of glistening white snow like a glorious winter wonderland, where the icicles dangled off the trees like delicate crystals. Then the cold, harsh winter days would slowly recede, which for me was always promptly announced by the showy arrival of the inflorescent lavender flowers from the eastern red budwoods that burst into bloom on their heyday before their summer leaves began to sprout. A couple of weeks later, the radiant elegance of spring would burst forth like a beautiful princess awakening from a long, deep slumber, and the sides of the road would burgeon out and flower with large, fragrant blooms of the dogwood trees, along with the crowning glory of saucer magnolia blooms, and the delicate white blossoms of Bradford pear and crabapple trees. Another time of the year I totally adored was the autumn months, when the whole countryside was ablaze with the most magnificent resplendent colours, where the dogwoods flushed a scarlet red, sugar maples a burning orange, sourwoods, oaks and sweet gums a rosy tint of pretty rouge, while the hickories turned a glorious gold, and it was difficult not to be beguiled, bedazzled, and intoxicated by this ensemble of exquisite autumn colours. So yes, I loved my job as a postal worker, most especially the wonderful people that I would meet. As for many, I was an ever-constant in their lives, and the familiar, amicable, and friendly face many began to trust. Of course, I had special customers who gave me candies, cookies, and presents. One of these endearing people was a delightful woman called Eleanor Markham, whose husband had recently died from a long drawn-out illness. So now widowed, she was living on her farm alone, and her two sons were more than a little eager to turf her out of her farmhouse and encourage her to move into an old-age home. But that was the last thing Eleanor wanted to do. She would always express her misgivings, reservations, and trepidations to me over a cup of hot tea. I could never deliver post to Eleanor without her insisting that I took my tea break at her home, which became a customary thing for me to do, as Eleanor was a matriarch figure in my life, and I genuinely enjoyed and appreciated her effervescent company. Better still, she made the most delicious chocolate brownies that you've ever tasted in your life, that were quite frankly awesome and impossible to resist, unless you were a saint, which I most certainly was not. It was on a Wednesday morning when I was driving down the precipitous dirt road through Eleanor's large cattle gate, with the farm name Cedar Tree Hollow attached to a large oak tree. My postal carrier wobbled and shook precariously as I drove towards the large 1800s farmhouse that stood proudly on the land like a wizened old friend. I parked in the paved driveway and saw the familiar, slender, sprightly figure of Eleanor standing in the doorway of her home, eagerly awaiting for me to accompany her for my usual piping hot cup of tea. I smiled happily to myself, because I warmed to Eleanor. I could tell as I strided over to her, on this lovely spring morning, with the post in my hand, that she was looking very unsettled and somewhat discomposed. "Come in," she said, pushing me through the front door, bobbing her small head of grey curls to the left and right, glancing over my shoulders with her earnest blue eyes, almost as if she suspected we were being secretly scrutinised in the shadows by a pair of unseen eyes. Eleanor swiftly placed her hands on my back, pushing me forwards down the entrance hall into the living room, where the tea was already prepared for us, as I could see the steam rising from the teapot, and there was a huge pile of chocolate brownies on an elegant Royal Doulton plate, ready to be devoured, and I was more than a little eager to oblige. I placed down the large handful of letters on the upholstered chair and wasted no time in grabbing a brownie. "Is everything all right, Eleanor?" I asked, taking a large, scrumptious bite of my brownie. "Forgive me for saying this, but you do look rather unsettled this morning, and you're acting quite perturbed and disquieted, if you don't mind my saying so. What is troubling you?" "That is because I am unsettled, young Bernard. Thank you for noticing," she said, looking at me with troubled eyes that displayed a measure of vulnerability that I'd never ever discerned before. I watched her hands wobbling precariously as she poured me my tea and handed me a piping hot cup. "Thank you," I said. "Come on, Eleanor. I need to know what is bothering you. I can sense something is really up, and I'm not going to leave until you tell me what it is. You know the saying, a problem shared is a problem halved, so go on, tell me what's bothering you." "Well, you know how I've been telling you that my 2 boys have been trying to turf me out of my farmhouse." "Oh, that," I said. "Well, you know exactly what I think about that, Eleanor. No one can force you to do something you don't want to do. This is your house, and you're the rightful owner. You can do with it as you want. You might be in your 80s, but I can see you're as fit as a fiddle, and you're physically very well and coherent. You can stay here as long as you like, until you feel differently. Besides, I do have my own secret agenda," I joked. "For you staying around my postal jurisdiction, that is, because I enjoy our little chats, Eleanor, and let's face it, no one makes better brownies than you do." "That's so nice of you to say, Bernard. That's why I really love having you around. You're so respectful, reverential and courteous, which is more than I can say for some people around here, like my 2 scheming boys, who both seem to have stepped up their duplicitous little game with me. And it's getting nasty," said Eleanor. "Very nasty." "Sorry, Eleanor, but you've completely lost me. What do you mean it's getting nasty? And what have your sons done this time? I suppose I shouldn't ask that question, but I'm going to anyway." "I have never admitted this to anyone," said Eleanor, "and I'm ashamed to have to acknowledge this about my own flesh and blood. But while I love my sons, I've never ever liked them. Do you understand what I'm actually saying?" "You love them, but you don't like them." I meditated on the words, trying to make sense of them. "Sorry, Eleanor, it sounds like a contradiction in terms. What exactly do you mean?" "My 2 boys are impudent brats, despite the fact that they're fully grown up," said Eleanor. "There's no kind way of saying this. To put it mildly, they've always been in trouble with the law, and still get up to all kinds of unsavoury shenanigans, and I assure you they would stop at nothing to get what they want, and they're now employing very dubious actions to get me to leave this house of mine, and what's even more appalling is that they have no clue that I'm on to their devious charades. They really believe I'm naive, dim-witted and ignorant, a silly, witless old bat that has no clue as to what really is going on. "Why are they so eager for you to leave?" I asked her, looking bewildered. "It's not because they have my best interest at heart, if that's what you're thinking. Theo, my eldest, has an insatiable appetite to move into this farmhouse with that dreadful hen-pecking wife of his, and to hoggishly take over this farm of mine, using the profits for his own self-indulgent pleasures, with only a small portion of the income used to cover the costs of my care at an old age home. Their father would be turning in his grave to see their abysmal treatment of me. My audacious boys even had the shameless impertinence to send Pastor Josh Miller around to the house to try and encourage me to leave this farm. You know, that large man with the round podgy face and piggy eyes buried beneath mounds of flesh? Oh, him, I laughed. What did he have to say? Well, after eating over a dozen of my brownies washed down with 4 cups of tea, he had the irreverent audacity to tell me that given my great advancing age and the physical degeneration of an aging body, that my sons were absolutely right and I should consider moving to an old age home forthwith. "What a cheek," I said. "You're so young for your age and as active as any youngster I know, maybe more so." I said to him, "Pastor Josh, age is just a number, and I assure you that I'm in perfectly good health. And if you don't mind my saying so, it's a little like the pot calling the kettle black, because you're a fine one to give me advice. If you were in perfect health yourself, I might listen to you more. But I did notice that you were out of breath walking from your car to the living room, which means you're dreadfully unfit. I also noticed that you have high blood pressure. Well, I've heard about that. Fatty liver disease and diabetes, not to mention you are definitely obese. Looking at you at a guess, I would say you're approximately 500 pounds. How dare you come here lecturing me on moving to an old age home based all upon my age, not on my health at the bequest of my sons, when you should take a long hard look at yourself first? Oh my word, Eleanor, I'm impressed with you. I bet you that did not go down too well. How did the pastor react?" "Not very well, I'm afraid. He went red in the face and said that he hadn't come here to be insulted by me, and that he was leaving at once. I said, 'Good, and don't come back, Pastor Josh, unless you have something sensible to say, or you want to read the word of God to me. Otherwise, be gone from me.' She continued, 'You see, I'm in the fight of my life, Bernard, against my own guileful sons, who've been trying to scare me witless as their final ploy or tactic, if you like, to get me to leave my beloved farmhouse, when I'm in perfect health, as you can see, and not in need of any physical assistance or care.' 'Scare you?' I said. 'You never said anything about that, Eleanor. Why would your sons scare you? That is a seriously unkind and insane thing for them to do.' I was coming to that part of the story. You'll be surprised, Bernard dear, how low some people are willing to stoop in order to get their own way, even if it means scaring their mother half to death in the process. My oldest son, Theo, who's over 6 foot tall, lanky and well-built, has been dressing up in an ape costume. He's been running around my backyard in the middle of the night, banging on the wooden rafters to wake me up. I see him pressing his face against the window, squashing his large nose against the glass so it smudges the whole pane, and he promptly proceeds to make some ridiculous fake grunting sounds. And I know it's him. I could recognize him anywhere, based on his build and size. He's not fooling anyone, least of all me, and doesn't scare me one little bit. On the contrary, it disgusts me that he's behaving in such a juvenile fashion. I was stunned at this appalling revelation, and astonished at the lengths that Eleanor's son was going to in order to scare his own mother out of her home. As for dressing up in an ape costume, that was rather insane and ridiculous. Eleanor was no fool, and anyone with a grain of intelligence knows that we don't have apes wandering around our backyards in North America, especially not human-looking gorillas like Eleanor was describing. "I mean, the costume is a dead giveaway," said Eleanor. "Theo is dressing just like a human in an ape suit, and is barely bothering to disguise his human-like face, which he covers in a large layer of tan shoe polish. I absolutely know it's him. I wasn't born yesterday, and I'm not a complete idiot." "So did you call him out on this prank?" I asked Eleanor. "No, of course I didn't, because either way I stand to lose, don't you see? If I claim to my boys that I saw Theo dressed up in an ape racing around my backyard in the middle of the night and banging the sides of my house trying to scare me, he'll deny it, of course, and then they'll both have grounds to have me committed, claiming I'm delusional and have the first stages of Alzheimer's disease, or I'm losing my mind. As that never happened, they'll deny it, of course. That will give them all the ammunition they need to use against me, to make me leave this house of mine, and I'm not having them doing that to me. If I call the police, and they arrest Theo, well, I'm grousing at my own son, and I don't want to do that. Do you not see how delicate the situation is for me? I think I do, I said. How often is your son dressing up and acting as an ape? Well, he's been pulling off this stunt every night this week at about 12 o'clock. Who knows what he'll do next? He may possibly pretend to be a ghost, but if I was giving him any advice, I'd tell him to go and get a better costume. I wouldn't put anything past him. I'm not remotely scared of any of his tactics, but I am inconvenienced by being woken up in the middle of the night like this. I have an idea, I said. I'll have to run it over with the wife, of course, but how about I stay at your house overnight, so that I can be a witness as to what is going on here, and we can get to the bottom of this incredible situation that you have going on. If you're sure you don't mind, said Eleanor, that would be so appreciated. At least I'll have a witness as to what is going on. And so it was that I slept overnight in the very elegant spare room at Eleanor's home, and about 12:10 I was awoken to a loud rattling sound, as if something very big was banging the sides of the house and making a huge thunderous commotion. On hearing this, I sat bolt upright in bed, filled with an overwhelming sense of disgust. It was inexcusable and repugnant that Eleanor's own son was trying to scare the poor old woman like this, just to get her to leave her farm. It was a cruel, heinous and atrocious thing to do, and I wasn't going to let Theo get away with this insidious little act of his. No, I wasn't. I could see that Eleanor was in the hall, clad in her dressing gown and slippers, and was pointing at this huge hairy creature staring in at her through the window. I did not want to be seen and observed by Theo, so I cautiously hid behind the couch and took a peek at him very closely without him discerning me. He appeared to have his face glued to the window, which was a huge giveaway, and he was making some strange, very peculiar grunts that were way too over the top to be believable. I manoeuvred my body carefully and cautiously behind Eleanor's furniture, crawling and sliding along the ground like a snake, until I reached the entrance hall. Then, on 2 feet, I tiptoed into Eleanor's large kitchen and stealthily pushed open the back door. Then, standing close alongside the wall, I followed it until I reached the far side, where the critter was hunched down, staring in at Eleanor through the window. I knew it was Theo. I could see him clearly, as Eleanor's outside light was gleaming brightly. I immediately pounced on Theo, pressing my weight on his body and holding him down as hard as I could. "You think this is a joke, boy? Scaring your mother half to death like this? You ought to be ashamed of yourself. And get this silly ape suit off you. It's not fooling anyone, least of all me." I tried to pull at the hair on the body, and to my astonishment, I realized it was real. I was gobsmacked. Suddenly a light bulb illuminated my consciousness with a blinding revelation. This was not Theo, I realized in astonishment. This beast was a living, breathing being that was so remarkably human that it was almost uncanny. Granted, there were powerful ape-like influences, most poignantly seen in the long, shaggy, dark hair that covered the body, in what I'd initially believed was an appallingly bad ape suit, with overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head that surrounded the human-like face like a hairy cape. The critter appeared confounded, especially since I'd pounced on him so unexpectedly. For a second he stared at me with disbelief and astonishment. He seemed dumbfounded. He regarded me with his deep-set eyes, seemingly staggered that I dared to challenge him. Obviously this was not something he was used to. He pushed my body violently with his overlong arms, with such a brutal, savage force that I fell backwards onto the ground on my back, where I found myself staring up at this anomalous critter's dark eyes, which in certain lights beheld a very distinct red eye shine that was exceedingly menacing. By this time I was terrified. My heart was pumping so fast, while my adrenaline was surging through my body like a steam train. I realised that whatever this creature was, it was without doubt an apex predator, and with little effort, much like swatting a fly, it could easily kill me. I knew I was in perilous danger, but staggering back onto my feet was not even an option for me, as my body seemed almost superglued to the ground because I simply could not get up. I watched in horror as the critter curled back his lips to reveal a glistening white pair of large teeth, and then it let out the most terrifying growl, and I assure you this ominous sound was far more intimidating and threatening than the growl of a lion. By this time I was shaking, and before I could think of anything, the critter lunged towards me with one of his legs and kicked me so hard that I could hear the bone in my upper leg crack, and I knew I had broken my femur. I was certain the creature was going to unleash several more kicks upon my crumpled form, but instead it glided away towards the woodland area on Eleanor's land, only glancing back at me once, and then vanishing from our sight. To cut a long story short, the ambulance arrived shortly after that incident, and I was admitted to hospital with a broken femur. Of course, I never told anyone what had really transpired. I received many concerned visits from Eleanor, who was desperately worried about me, and shocked to have discovered that the really bad-looking ape suit did not belong to her son in disguise, and was in fact a real creature. But we had no idea what it was at the time. We chose to tell no one about our spurious encounter, for fear of being ridiculed and disbelieved. But all these years later, I know that we encountered a Bigfoot, and to think that I actually pounced on this creature boggles my mind to this very day, as it was possibly the stupidest thing that I've ever done in my life. I truly consider myself lucky to have escaped with my life, because the power of this mighty beast was unquestionable. But I assure you, if you didn't know any better, you could easily be fooled into believing the Bigfoot was a man in an ape suit. Looking back, I do not know why for an entire week that this Bigfoot was making such a raucous commotion outside Eleanor's farmhouse and staring in at her by sticking its face to her window and watching her curiously with a transfixed intensity that I shan't forget in a hurry. Eleanor was never afraid, as she falsely believed the creature was Theo, and maybe her lack of fear gave the Bigfoot the confidence to study her more intently. I truly believe these creatures are as fascinated by humans as we are by them. On reflection, I believe it was a youngster that was curious about humans because the Bigfoot I saw was only 6 foot tall, 400 pounds, and about 2.5 feet wide across the shoulder area. I noted it was very well built, lanky and lean, much like Theo is, and even the face reminded me of Theo, although it did have a beard around the chin area, and leathery grey skin, and of course a large flat nose. It possibly knew Eleanor lived on her own, and saw her as an easy human subject to study. That's why he was so curious about her. I'm glad to inform you, though, that the creature never came back to bother her again. It would seem that Eleanor's biggest fears never came to pass, for she didn't end up living in an old-age home after all, which was an idea she despised and totally dreaded. She lived out the last days of her life in her farmhouse until one day she didn't wake up. She died in her sleep at the grand age of 97, still in robust health and sound mind, which in my opinion is the very best way to go. Now that I know I saw a Bigfoot, I always hope for another random encounter, but I'm of the opinion that you'll only encounter a Bigfoot when you least expect it, and not when you're intentionally seeking him out. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Nicole, and I grew up in North Carolina in a sizable double-storey log home, with very large windows overlooking arresting views of the mountains and surrounded by towering red maples, sweet gums and oak trees that rarely looked resplendent when their leaves turned red and gold in the autumn every year. I was raised by my birth father and my grandmother on my mother's side, and we lived in close proximity to a quaint, charming town full of southern charm and warm, convivial people. In our part of the world, there were hiking trails and rugged country roads, flanked with trees on every side. My father was a local artist, and he made a living by selling his artworks to various galleries around North America and Europe. He received many commissions for his extraordinary contemporary pieces that invited much praise, but you either loved or hated his work, which meant that it provoked emotional responses from people, which is what every artist is desirous to accomplish, because a negative or positive reaction means that in some way you were moved by the artwork, and that is a good thing. Personally, without wishing to be biased, although I probably am, given that I am my father's daughter, I truly thought my father's work was awesome, especially the pastel colour sequences that were inspired by his creative, ingenious imagination. His work was so tactile that you could literally run your hand down the painting and feel the layers and roughened textures of the paint, and fully appreciate the individuality and uniqueness of the art piece. I would say that based on physical appearances, my father looked every part an artist. He wore his long brown hair in a ponytail and embraced polo necks, tight-fitting shirts and dark jeans. And when strangers met him for the very first time, they always assumed and guessed that he was in the arts and was either a writer, a poet, a painter or a movie producer. As an only child, I was exceedingly spoilt, with fabulous holidays abroad and beautiful things that I fancied acquiring, rather like my toy poodle called Duchess and a white Persian cat called Dusty Lady. I called her that because her white fluffy coat was always cloaked in dust, as she loved rolling around in the dirt. I guess my father felt guilty that my birth mother was not around to raise me, but where she was, no one could fathom. I understood from my grandmother that even private detectives that the pair of them had hired together to try and help relocate my birth mother were of little assistance, as my mother never left a paper trail behind her, nor did she live in one location long enough to establish a fixed address. This was why my father had literally begged my grandmother to move in with us in order to help raise me, after I'd been dumped on his doorstep as a baby. I believe he felt overwhelmed with the responsibility of taking care of a young child and needed all the hands-on help he could possibly get, along with a tangible female influence in my life. My grandmother was a widow at the time, so she was more than a little eager to help my father, and since then she became an intrinsic part of our family unit. Even my father loved her as if she was his own mother, and valued her guidance and expertise in his life when it came to raising me. I'm not sure why my father never actually married himself, although he did have a string of girlfriends from time to time, but those relationships were always fleeting. I think he was not the marrying type, and once he admitted as much to me, as I think he felt tying the knot with another woman was tantamount to having your wings clipped, and that he did not want. My grandmother lived on the upper floor of our log home, and she became to me the mother I never had, and in a strange, rather peculiar way, I came to be the kind of daughter she'd always yearned for, as her previous daughter just did not conform to traditional stereotypes of what was considered normal, although there was nothing that was impaired in her daughter, either mentally or physically. It would seem her daughter Cordelia, who was of course my birth mother, was a maverick and lone ranger, if you like. My grandmother was the one who brought a wholesome maternal feeling and influence in our home, as the delicious appetizing aromas of her delectable, flavoursome southern cooking would waft around the house, sounding the alarm bells of our stomachs and alerting us to our hunger pangs. My father and I would gravitate towards the kitchen, hoping for a piece of my grandmother's luscious pumpkin pie. She was the one that would help me with my homework when I returned home from school, and one of the greatest cheerleaders of my young life. I soon learnt that my real mother was a free spirit or a hippie, and the kind of person who just travelled around almost aimlessly, rather like a gypsy, without the wagon and wheels, so to speak. And she had lived this individualistic bohemian lifestyle all her life, through choice, sleeping on people's couches or trailers, or camping out on the beach, hitchhiking rides with truck drivers, or snagging lifts on the back of motorbikes. All her life she had managed to find cash-in-hand jobs, from cleaning to waitressing, and as life models for artists who enjoyed painting still lifes. My mother had fallen pregnant with me after a brief fling with my father, who had met her when she was modelling for one of his nude works. Once I was born, my mother simply deposited me on my father's front doorstep, rather like a surprise, unexpected gift, with a note saying, "The baby's yours. Can't keep her. Love, Cordelia." My father assures me that my impetuous, unheralded, serendipitous arrival on his front doorstep was by far the best gift he'd ever received in his life. I remember my grandmother saying to me once, "Your mother, Cordelia, is unlike any girl I've ever known. Sometimes I think she was a star child, birthed from some other galaxy. I would find her sleeping under the stars under her duvet cover when she was only 6 years old. I would have to drag her back into the house, kicking and screaming, because she didn't want to sleep indoors. I took her to a child psychologist once, as I was so concerned and perturbed by her outlandish, idiosyncratic behaviour. But the psychologist assured me that Cordelia was a perfectly normal child, but incredibly unique and different, seemingly unprogrammed by the school system or media that tends to indoctrinate our lives from the moment we're born, influencing the very way we think. But it seemed to appear that it had not impacted Cordelia at all. I remember her saying, "It's like she comes from another world." Cordelia was a peculiar, enigmatic child, so in tune with nature, and so disinterested in toys, sweets and parties like other kids her own age. I do remember hosting a birthday party for her once, and she was nowhere to be found, not even to blow out the candles on her birthday cake. It was like she wasn't in attendance at her very own party, which was a huge embarrassment to me, so I pretended that she was in bed with a dicky tummy. I found her later, sitting up in the tree feeding peanuts to a squirrel, having the time of her life. Even at school she would skip classes and the teachers would find her chasing butterflies in the playground. It was like your mother just wanted to live in the open air and be one with the natural world. She loved hugging trees and running around the yard, picking up flowers and collecting tadpoles in glass jars. She loved all that kind of stuff. She certainly hated the trappings of materialism and wasn't at all interested in money and things like that. They meant nothing to her. Growing up, she ran away from home too many times to count, and there were no nefarious reasons why she would run away, as she wasn't abused or anything like that. I believe she simply couldn't bear being in the house for more than 2 days at a time, because she would quite literally have cabin fever and feel claustrophobic. "Well, where do you suppose she is now?" I asked my grandmother. For all I know, she could be living in Thailand, or basking in the sun on a tropical island. Sometimes I wonder if she fell into bad company and is no longer alive, said my grandmother, wiping away a tear. Cordelia was one of a kind. You'd have to meet her to know what I'm talking about. I don't think there's anyone out there even remotely like her. And if there was, I promise you, I would be the first one to be very surprised. "Well, can't you find her, Granny?" I asked. "Someone must know where she is." My grandmother had put me on her lap and rocked me backwards and forwards while she stroked my mane of long brown hair with her fingers. "Sweetheart," she said, "some people don't want to be found. We can only hope that one day when her feet stop itching, that she might just come back to North Carolina in search for you." "You don't think she's forgotten about me?" I asked, looking very worried. "Of course not, sweetheart," my grandmother had said. "Where on earth did you get that ludicrous idea from? How could anybody ever forget you? I'm sure your mother loves you very much, but right now she doesn't want any responsibility or incumbency. But don't take that personally. That's just the way your mother is." As I got older, I did begin to resent my birth mother, when I realised that her failure to take care of me as a baby was possibly because she was the most selfish person who had ever graced the face of the earth. I knew in my heart that if I had a baby of my own, I could never just dump it on the father's doorstep and run away. And the more I thought about it, the more I despised my mother for what she had done. One day when I was about 17 years old, there was a curious low knock at the door, and my grandmother went to open it. I could hear her gasping and saying, "Cordelia, is that you? Is that really you, sweetheart?" She then was cradling a strange woman in her arms and sobbing, holding on to her for dear life, as if she was utterly terrified of letting go. The woman looked like a poor ruffian, much like you see in those historical movies that lived on the streets and swept chimneys in bygone days for a living, receiving mere pennies for their valiant efforts. The woman, I realised with shocked horror, was my birth mother. She looked so bedraggled and dirty, that you could barely make out her face. Her hair was so knotted and tangled and twisted and hung around her in huge, matted clumps. All I could see were these bright blue eyes staring vacantly through this clay-like mud, as the dark dirt on her face almost eradicated her features. I could discern that the woman looked thin and rather emaciated, and her countenance was subdued and sad. "Come in, dear," said my grandmother. "Let's get you cleaned up before David gets home. I would hate him to see the mother of his precious beloved daughter looking like this. Come in, dear. Let's sort you out." Before long, my grandmother had run a hot bath for my mother, and I could hear her scrubbing her down in the bathroom. But it would seem that my mother never uttered a single word, and was as quiet as a church mouse. It was almost like she was spaced out, and not even present in her own body, which of course was not the truth. I listened curiously at the bathroom door, as my grandmother was scrubbing her down. "Oh my, oh my, oh my," I heard her say. "In all my born days, I don't think I've ever seen anybody so filthy. It seems like the dirt is superglued to you, and is so tough it's almost hard to remove. Where have you been, Cordelia, sweetheart? And why haven't you been in touch for so many years? Do you know a day hasn't gone by that I haven't worried myself to death about you? For all I knew, you could have been lying dead in a ditch on the side of the road somewhere." As my grandmother was talking away, my mother never said a single word. Eventually my grandmother brought her out of the bathroom, wrapped up in a large white fluffy towel, and I was able to get a much better view of my mother, and I beheld that her skin was very fair, and her hair was an attractive honey blonde colour. I noticed that the bottoms of her feet were so incredibly hard that it was clear she had not been wearing shoes for a very long time. I don't even believe a thorn could go through her foot, because it would have caused her no pain whatsoever, as her soles were so hard and toughened. "Sweetheart, have you got some clothes for your mother to wear?" my grandmother had asked me. "She's as skinny as a rake. All my clothes will be far too big for her." "I'll go and get her one of my dresses," I'd said. I watched my grandmother cutting my mother's hair off in fascination, as huge clumps of the matted hair fell to the ground. My grandmother worked efficiently and speedily with the scissors, rather like a professional hairdresser, transforming my mother's hair into a short, funky cut that rather reminded me of a hedgehog, but on my mother's little face the look was rather endearing, and my mother actually looked rather cute. It really was strange having my mother in our home, and I did feel more grown up than she was. I began to feel really rather ashamed that I'd resented her for so long, for she seemed helpless and pathetic. It was like she was so lost and disorientated, rather like a drowned kitten trying to find its bearings. I noted that it was only when she was walking around the yard, touching all the trees and watching the birds, that I ever actually saw her smile. At night she chose to sleep on the swinging chair on the patio with a duvet over her body, but all the time she never said a single word. My father was very kind to her, but if my grandmother thought that she would get the two of them to fall in love with each other and ignite some kind of magical spark between the two of them, it was clear that that was never going to happen, because without wishing to be brutally unkind, my mother almost seemed feral or wild, and she had about as much domestication as a squirrel that stores away its acorns for the winter months. My mother's wildness was rarely confirmed to me one morning when I arose early to see her sitting on the patio step, eating a frog very happily, and breaking away its legs and tucking them into her mouth, and she was clearly enjoying her meal. I stood there staring in disbelief, hardly believing what I was actually seeing, and I kept what I'd seen to myself for fear of distressing my grandmother, who would find such an unsavoury revelation very appalling. One day my mother began to talk, and no one was more surprised than I was, and I rudely said to her, "I thought the cat had got your tongue. You haven't said a word since you've been here." "I prefer to think than to talk," she had said. "Where have you been all this time?" I asked her. "You do realise no one has seen sight or sound of you for over 17 years. "All over the place and everywhere, if you must know," she said. "I've slept on people's couches, hitchhiked around the countryside, slept on beaches, in abandoned homes, and pretty much anywhere that you can possibly think of." "Why are you so weird?" I asked her. "I don't mean to be rude, but you are very strange. Why would you leave a beautiful home, security, good food, and a loving place to live, even your own mother, and abandon your own child, just to live in the wild? It seems nonsensical to me. I'm sorry, but I just don't understand." "You think I'm weird?" said my mother, smiling, as she seemed to find my comments rather amusing. "If what you say is true, that would make every single wild animal that lives under the stars weird. Would that not be the case?" "You are human," I said. "Humans should be civilized, but animals are wild." "You think being wild is a bad thing?" asked my mother. "How many people in this modern world, with their superficiality and modern lifestyle, could last a single day in the wilderness? I doubt they could hack it, maybe for a week, but not more, because they're so conditioned to creature comforts and the hardships of nature they simply can't fathom. Are you telling me you prefer to sleep under the stars than in a cosy bed at night? What about when it's freezing cold out there? Someone like you could die of exposure. You haven't exactly got much meat on you." "I feel the cold just like the next person," said my mother. "But yes, if you must know, I do prefer sleeping under the stars, especially on a warm night. But that is not always possible. Sometimes nature drives you under cover to keep you warm and dry." "You really are so odd," I said to my mother. "Granny is right. There's no one out there like you." My mother laughed at me and then piped. "You have a half-brother out there somewhere," she said. "I can assure you that he would find you to be the one that's very odd, and would consider my lifestyle so much more normal compared to yours." "I have a brother," I gasped. "Oh, please don't tell me. You abandoned him on someone's doorstep like you did with me. Is that right?" "No, I did not," my mother said. "He was taken away from me by his grandmother, and I don't know where he is," she said. And at this she began to cry, making me feel really bad. I was amazed, because it was clear that my mother was very distressed about losing her son, and I secretly wished that she had felt like that about me. It did bring on a little bit of the green-eyed monster, I'm not going to lie, because she had been so willing to dump me on my father's doorstep. But she seemed so distressed about my brother. "Please don't cry," I begged. "I've never been good at dealing with tears. If it's any consolation to you, I'm sure you could get a private detective to try and locate your son. Everybody leaves a paper trail, except you, of course," I teased. At this my mother burst out laughing. "A private detective to find his grandmother," she giggled. "You could pay the man millions of dollars, and I guarantee he'd never find my beloved son for me. I'd have a better chance of finding him myself than any private detective. I can assure you of that. He wouldn't even have the first clue where the wild ones live." "Sorry, Mum, you've completely lost me. Who and what are the wild ones?" This is the peculiar story my mother told me in her own words without exaggeration, and whether you believe it or not is entirely your decision. But I truly do not accept that she was lying, as she had nothing to gain from such outrageous revelations, and if this story is true, it could have only ever happened to someone like her, because God really did break the mold when he made her. Personally, I'm inclined to believe that everything she told me is in no way fabricated or fictitious. I'm sure your grandmother has told you that I just love living in nature. It's where I feel comfortable and most at home. I just belong there. My only big regret is that all my life I've had to pinch clothes from people's washing lines in order to find something decent to wear. I've also bought things at thrift shops, and people have often graciously given me old clothes, blankets and stuff like that. But I've willingly chosen to live like a hillbilly or gypsy, if you like, pretty much all my life. There are, of course, times when I did take on jobs in quaint country towns, working as a waitress or sweeping up hair in a salon, washing dishes or people's cars. Sometimes I would pop to the church to receive charitable donations, and they always obliged me by giving me money. They could see that I wasn't an alcoholic or druggie. Money means nothing to me, but I had to buy myself essential supplies like pots, knives, tents, raincoats and sleeping bags, and when I'd had enough provisions, I would spend weeks at a time in the woods all on my own, enjoying the natural fauna and flora, and of course indigenous wildlife. I was in my element, so incredibly happy. Forgive me, I am trying to understand you. Believe me, I am. But surely you got bored and lonely out there in the woods on your own. Are you kidding? Bored and lonely? Oh, you're crazy. What's boring about trees, flowers, birds, butterflies and indigenous animals? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. On the contrary, I find the things that you're so interested in, like restaurants and televisions and movie theatres, mundane and hideously dull. But nature, she's exciting and ever-changing. It's official, I said. You truly are weird. My mother continued with her story. Well, one day I discovered this woodland retreat. It was very beautiful. The trees were so old and mature that they towered up into the sky like skyscrapers, and the ground was covered in pretty flowers and lacy ferns and soft moss. And there was a silvery stream that meandered through the woods, and a stunning rock pool with a fabulous waterfall. I set up camp around this pool, pitching up my tent, and I'd go swimming there every single day. And one day I realised that I was being watched, and that was when I met Made of Silver. And from the moment we met, the attraction between us was magnetic. Made of Silver, I asked. What an extraordinary name for a man. That wasn't his name, said my mother. That's what I chose to call him, because he was so handsome and covered with the most beautiful long, flowing silver hair all over his body, with the exception of his face, of course. What do you mean, covered with silver hair? You're not making sense to me. Made of Silver was a wild man who's far more adapted to the natural world than I was, and was incredibly handsome, with the most gorgeous eyes you've ever seen in your life, and a body that is so strong and powerful. I've actually seen him pick up a car with his own hands, as if it was nothing. You've got to be kidding, I said. No one can do that. Well, Made of Silver can. He was powerfully strong, and so are the rest of his people. He was easily 8 foot tall and 700 pounds and 3 foot across the shoulder area. I promise you, he and his people have lived in these forests, mountainous ridges and caves in North America for many generations. All his family members are incredible foragers, hunters and fishermen. Does he speak a language? I asked. Yes, he does, but not one that you would be acquainted with. But I have begun to understand it. Go on, I said. Tell me all about your relationship with Made of Silver. Well, we spent every day together. He would always return home to his family in the evenings, as they would go hunting and foraging together during the hours of darkness, when I was usually asleep. Before long, Made of Silver and I fell in love, and he took me back to his home, which is in a lovely cave in a mountainous ridge. The wild people are like gypsies. They wander from one place to another, much like I have done all my life. But while they're settled in one place, they can spend weeks or even months there at a time. When Made of Silver brought me back to his home, his father was over the moon to meet me and made me feel so welcome. He kept whooping with delight. But his mother was not happy and was very aggrieved about my presence. She began to scream, and then she hit Made of Silver with her fists on his chest, but he didn't care. When Made of Silver wasn't looking, she threw acorns and pine cones at me to express her indignation. And during the night she would take away my duvet cover and hide it somewhere, hoping that I would freeze to death. But Made of Silver always kept me warm with his body heat, and he would fetch a deer pelt for me to cover up my body, and we would snuggle together all night. One day I discovered to my amazement that I was pregnant, and Made of Silver and his father were so ecstatic by this exciting, astonishing and thrilling revelation, they could hardly believe it. They kept touching my stomach, with looks of wondrous awe on their faces, and whooping in delight. But his mother sulked bitterly, and became belligerent and very peeved. I truly think she was possessed by a green-eyed monster. She resented the incredible fuss I was receiving from the 2 men in her life, who doted on me and stopped at nothing to care for my every need, watching over me like a fragile doll that just might break. They were that protective over me. In protest, Made of Silver's mother deviously brought a female around to the cave, covered in jet-black hair, who was considered quite a catch by all the wild men. She kept pushing this poor female towards Made of Silver, as she wanted him to procreate with her. I'm not sure where the poor creature came from. I did feel sorry for her, because Maid of Silver completely ignored her, but she soon got the message and returned to her people. You could see he only had eyes for me, and his kind are at the best of times monogamous. It's just the way they are. When my baby boy was born, he was so beautiful, and everybody was so excited about the birth, most especially Maid of Silver's mother, who even helped me deliver my own son. She just doted on her beloved grandchild that I called Dawning Hope, who had green eyes, which was very unusual. I chose that name for my son because there was hope on the horizon, as I thought that the birth of my baby would change Maid of Silver's mother's attitude towards me. Well, I hoped it would. I was soon to realise that while she adored her grandson, she continued to despise and loathe me, and she screamed at me frequently, regularly assaulting me with barrages of acorns. A couple of months after my baby was born, I realised that Maid of Silver's mother was pregnant, and she was incredibly happy about this revelation, as was the whole family, myself included. I thought with another baby on the way, she would become amenable towards me, because our two children could interact together, but not a chance. One day I was cooking in a pot on an open fire and making a squirrel stew for myself, because I find a raw squirrel makes me feel very sick and queasy. But all of Maid of Silver's family prefer to eat everything raw, and I can only eat some things that way. I did not feel like eating the stew because it tasted bitter, and so I left it, and Maid of Silver, who was hungry, ate it instead of me. And then within minutes, he was literally dead. "You are joking," I gasped. "Do you think he had a heart attack?" "Absolutely not," said my mother. I knew, of course, what had happened. Maid of Silver's mother had poisoned the stew with a cocktail of lethal berries, and she believed I was going to eat it. When she discovered that she had accidentally poisoned her own son, she was irate and incensed, and began screaming at me. We buried Maid of Silver, and both of his parents were completely devastated by his tragic demise. But I think Maid of Silver's father was completely clueless that his guileful, duplicitous partner was responsible for his son's senseless, untimely death. His son had just died, as far as he was concerned, from a bad heart or something else. Who knows what he actually thought? His kind are much more accepting about strange, unusual, bizarre deaths, as it is part of life, or nature, if you like. I was so devastated about Maid of Silver's demise that I would sit at his grave and just cry for many days. I often left my baby in his mother's charge, which was my biggest mistake, as I should have known she could not be trusted with him. One day when I returned to the cave, Maid of Silver's mother, his father, and my baby had all just gone. There were 3 stones left in a perfect line, which was a message that meant 3 of us were here, but we've moved on. I knew that Maid of Silver's mother, who is the dominant partner and tends to call all the shots, had decided to abscond with my baby so that she could have 2 children to raise all of her own. "So you're saying my brother is with Maid of Silver's mother?" At this astonishing revelation, I became emotional and surprised myself as tears spilled down my cheeks like salty raindrops, as it dawned on me that I had a little brother out there that was missing. "So my brother is with his grandmother, and you can't find him anywhere. Is that what you're saying?" I asked. "Well, I've searched for him for an entire year now, and I can't find sight or sound of Maid of Silver's family, and they will never allow me to find them, as the wild people are incredibly elusive, and you rarely ever encounter one unless they want to be seen, or should they accidentally just cross your path, but that isn't always a common event." "Well, what did my baby brother look like?" I asked my mother. "Did he have silver hair on his body, like Maid of Silver?" "Oh, he was the cutest, most adorable baby. You would have loved him. He wouldn't stop smiling and gurgling. And when he was born, he was completely hairless. He looked no different to you. But within 6 weeks, he was covered in a fine layer of silver hair." "So you decided to come back here to see your other child. Is that why you came back?" I asked. "That's why I came back," said my mother. "I wanted to see you for one last time." When my mother said those words, I did not comprehend what she actually meant. But a week later I certainly did, because we found her deceased body floating on the pond in our land, and she had shot herself in the head with my father's rifle, and left a note for me, and one for my grandmother. I didn't ask her what hers said, but this was what mine read. Dearest Nicola, I really did come back to see you, as I couldn't leave without saying hello and then goodbye. I know you may think that I've taken the easy way out, ending my life like this, and that I'm a coward, and you're probably right on both counts. Made of Silver was quite literally the love of my life, and living without him has just been too hard for me to deal with, as my heart is broken in pieces, and I feel raw inside and completely lost. Now that I can't find your baby brother, there is no point in going on, because I know I will never find him. I really believe I will be reunited with my love on the other side, which is why leaving this place has such a huge appeal for me. I hope you can understand that. Please don't think that I do not love you, because I do. I am truly sorry that I left you on the doorstep when you were a baby, but believe me when I say it, it wasn't easy for me to do, and it was in your best interests, because you really deserved the bountiful pleasures of the modern world, which never held any appeal to me. In my heart, I have always been as wild as the wild men of the forests. With all my love, your loving mother, Cordelia. As you can imagine, I was devastated that my mother had taken her own life, but truly, in a strange way, I did understand. It was Romeo and Juliet, all over again. You see, my mother was not made for the material world. She was too fragile, delicate and sensitive for our modern society. And yet she was as tough as old boots when it comes to surviving in the wild. But it would seem her passion for the wild man was her greatest undoing, because she could not live without him. All this happened 20 years ago, and I'm now happily married with 2 children of my own, and they have a wonderful great-grandmother and grandfather in their lives, and I've noticed that they do have a propensity to enjoy the outdoors rather too much, which concerns me greatly. But my grandmother assures me that they're perfectly normal and are not exhibiting Cordelia's passionate obsession with nature. I do believe all these years later that Made of Silver was definitely a Bigfoot, and that somewhere out there in the forests of North America is my Bigfoot brother. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Carlson, and I'm originally from Lenox Hill in the Upper East Side of Manhattan in New York City, where I grew up with my parents in a prestigious townhouse along Madison Avenue, which is a maze of rather flashy-looking, intimidating designer shops, apartment buildings and townhouses, which can make you feel that unless you're carrying a Gucci handbag and wearing the latest designer fashion, you could feel awkward and out of place wandering into some of those shops, with the sales girls eyeing you with beady eyes, ready to pounce on you if you look like you're worth a bob or two. And if you look like you don't have any money at all, they'll almost glare at you with condescending looks of disapproval, as if to say, "What are you doing in our shop?" And for that reason, I've always hated the pretentiousness of these places. My parents run one of these rather glamorous, eclectic designer shops on Madison Avenue, with a snooty sales staff in their employ, who have that superior attitude that I can't stand. We sell a vast selection of grandiose, opulent, zooty merchandise to affluent customers from all over the world, and all the stuff is imported from London, Milan and New York. And as a result, my parents gave me a managerial position in their company, which involved travelling abroad to negotiate with many of our suppliers in regards to the product ranges we wished to purchase, and ensuring that we procured the best financial deals for the business to enhance our profit margins. At that time of my life, I was about 28 years old, with a university degree behind me, but really I had no idea what it was I wanted to do with my life. I had been working for my parents' designer business as a stopgap for myself, and although lucrative and very productive, I had about as much passion for the business as a honeybee has over a sugarless drink. Of course, this did not go down very well with both my parents, who were piling on the pressure for me to become fully involved in their business. But that was it. It was their business and not mine. "It's going places, son," my father had insisted. "The business is booming and is a household name now. It's a guarantee for success." I tried to explain to my father that this was his little nest that he had built for his family. And while his nest was indeed great, I wanted to build my own. You never hear of a wild bird raising its family in the very same nest that it was raised as a fledgling. That would be ridiculous, and the twigs and leaves in that nest would be so degraded and atrophied. Instead, the young male bird builds a brand new nest for its family with healthy twigs and leaves for a brand new auspicious beginning. I wanted to do exactly the same for my life. "You want to build your own nest, son, do you?" my father had said scathingly, with a distinct note of disapproval in his voice. "Do you know how many small businesses fail and fold every year? You have the opportunity to make it big on the back of my wings, and you want to throw this all away for a random shot in the dark or a dive in the deep end. You are impudent, mad, and frivolous, son." "I don't know, Dad," I said, "but your business does not interest or inspire me. Why would I want to do something for the rest of my life that I don't enjoy? I tell you what, I'll work for your business until I feel shepherded by the universe down another path for my life, and that is my final decision." "Fair enough, son," said my father, "but let me warn you, you could be waiting forever. Life does not work in quite the romantic, illustrious way you believe it does. If you're expecting a path to open up for you miraculously, you're dreaming. That never ever happens." Little did my father realize how wrong he was, and how my life was about to change and blossom in radical, dramatic ways that even I could never have envisaged possible for my life. It all began when I took a business trip to London on behalf of our family business, where I met up with one of our suppliers, a lovely young lady called Tammy Chesterfield, who was the manager of her father's affluent London business. During the week she lived in an upmarket flat in Mayfair, but her real home was an exquisite red-brick farmhouse in the Berkshire countryside, surrounded by acres of green pasture and plenty of Peruvian horses. During our meeting, Tammy persuaded me to stay at her family farmhouse for the weekend, where she lived with her husband James and 2 children during the weekends. It was a peculiar arrangement that is not uncommon in England, as many choose to avoid the incessant chaos of the daily commute. It would seem that James ran the farmhouse during the week, where he managed their farm and tethered their 2 children, while Tammy remained in London, commuting home to Berkshire for the weekends to spend with her family. Bear in mind, I had pretty much lived in New York most of my life, and had little experience of country life. Growing up, I had become tarnished with a superiority belief system and had been led to falsely conclude that people who lived in the American countryside were unsophisticated simpletons with completely different values to ours, and that we had about as much in common with each other as a butterfly has to a caterpillar. I was to find out how wrong and misinformed I really was. I must confess that the idyllic, memorable and magical weekend that I spent in the English countryside with Tammy and her lovely family literally ripped the blinders off my eyes, rather like a band-aid over an open wound. It enabled me to see a slower, easy-going pace of life that both intrigued and stirred me up. I found it far more appealing and attractive than the fast, bustling heartbeat of a very busy, high-octane city driven on its relentless surge of adrenaline, and a city that never really sleeps, nor does she calm down for a single moment. "I love the countryside," said Tammy. "I never did enjoy the big city. Everything in London is way too far-paced for me. Sometimes I feel like I can't breathe in the city, as it can become almost claustrophobic for me. Yet when I spend a weekend here in the countryside with my family, I feel re-energized again and uplifted. There's something so grounding about nature. It's like it helps you to come to your senses and find your bearings, if you know what I mean." "I wish Tammy would leave her job in London," piped James. "We all miss her terribly, especially when she leaves for London every week." "If you feel this way, Tammy, why don't you live in the countryside?" I asked her, "permanently. You could start up your own business out here." "Oh, I couldn't do that," she said, looking at me aghast. "What on earth would I do out here? At least with Daddy's business, I have long-term financial security for myself. If I start up my own business, I could fail, and I couldn't handle that." "What's wrong with failure?" I asked her. "It's like falling off your horse and getting back on again. You can only learn from your mistakes, as no one successful ever got to the winning post without making lots of mistakes along the way. You'll learn to ride without falling off sooner or later, and then you'll begin to wonder what all the fuss was all about." "You make it sound so easy, just like Ella," laughed Tammy. "Let me tell you, that woman has more sense in her than anyone I know. She tells me to pack up working for my father and to stop riding on the back of his success and to do something constructive and worthwhile out here in the country. She assures me that my fear of failure is my biggest stumbling block. If I followed my passions, I would find my way and be successful and much more fulfilled." "Who is Ella?" I asked curiously. "It sounds like she's talking common sense. I think I like her already." "Oh, she's a Romany gypsy that I visit for guidance. She lives in a caravan on the side of the woods. You should go and visit her. She could give you a reading and help guide you on your life path. She does give good advice and wisdom. She's worth a visit." "How does she do that?" I asked. I really could do with some guidance myself, but I can't say I'm sure that a Romany gypsy has the answers I'm looking for. "She reads energy and palms," said Tammy. "She claims it's a God-given gift. Let me take you to her. At the very least, it could be an interesting experience for you." "I'm not sure that I believe in something so outlandish as palm reading," I said, "but I suppose I'll give it a go. Why not? I haven't got much to lose." Before long, Tammy and I were walking down a pretty country lane, surrounded by verdant green countryside and ubiquitous statuesque trees. We took a swift turning to the right, and that was when I saw this very rusty, shabby, tumble-down-looking caravan parked on a high grassy embankment, fringed by some tall oak trees. There was a large canvas sign pinned above the canopy that read, "Romany Gypsy, Palm and Energy Readings by Ella." "I'm not sure about this, Tammy," I said, looking at the ramshackled grotty caravan in horror and feeling a growing sense of discomfort overcome me. I was clearly prejudiced by its grotty appearance and didn't think anything good could come out of it. I rubbed my moustache reflectively and said, "If this woman has such sound advice as you say, why is she living in a clapped-out caravan that looks like it's falling apart at the seams? Surely if she was so successful and gave accurate readings like some of the psychics you see in America, that she would be living in the lap of luxury, not in such a seedy, decrepit-looking caravan like this." "You really don't get it, do you?" laughed Tammy. "You've got this ludicrous, absurd notion that everybody wants to live like a king, surrounded by abundant wealth. It might actually surprise you to know that not everybody is like you. Ella's wealth is obtained from her God-given gift, and she acquires her abundance and joy from reading people's palms and steering them down the right path on their life journey, only charging them a couple of pounds in the process. One of her clients even offered to buy her a top-of-the-range caravan, but she refused the generous offer. Ella is very proud of her Romany gypsy heritage and her roots, and sees her life as a calling, not as an opportunity to get rich. It has never been about money for her, never." How Tammy persuaded me to go into that dilapidated caravan for a reading, I do not know, but before long I was seated very uncomfortably on a threadbare chair, waiting for Ella to read me my palm, feeling very much on edge. What the heck was I doing here, I thought to myself. I must need my head examining, going for a palm reading of all things. I glanced awkwardly around the caravan with a curious, intrigued interest, and I could see that despite its great age, the caravan was kept meticulously clean, almost as if its proud owner treated it with love, care and respect, and I felt secretly ashamed of myself for being so judgmental. Ella was not a youngster as I'd envisaged, but in her early 50s, and she wore a crocheted shawl over her long dark hair that was highlighted by pretty strands of grey. She regarded me quizzically, as though staring at a painting that she was trying to study. "You have a very reluctant energy," she said to me, eyeing me intensely with her dark brown eyes. "I sense you would rather be anywhere else but here. Are you really sure you want a reading? I won't take any offence if you should wish to leave." "I came here for a reading," I said reluctantly, handing her my tight, clammy palm. She took my hand from me, wiping the perspiration off my palm with a tissue and placing her fingers over my lifelines. "You are very cynical about palm reading, are you not?" I'm still feeling that very negative, oppressive dark cloud from you of doubt and disbelief. Do you not believe that the lines on your hand might very well be a roadmap for your life and your intended purpose? Not really, I said. None of that stuff makes any sense to me at all. So you don't believe in energy points, meridians and chakras, she asked me. Certainly not, I said. All that stuff is New Age nonsense. Ella examined my palm very closely, as though she was reading a book. You are very lost and confused, she said to me. You are desperately trying to find yourself, but you are like a blind man stumbling around in the darkness looking for the light. Am I right? It's like you're looking for your direction in life, and you simply can't find it. In a manner of speaking, I said, but I would like to know what to do with my life. I don't feel I've found my purpose. I will say this from your reading. You will never be happy in a big city. You are being drawn to the countryside, and God will make a way for you. And I see a woman involved, and 2 children in the picture. That's the path you need to follow. You need to work the land and feel the sun beat upon your brow. That is the only thing that will make you truly happy. It's your life's calling to work with the soil and to watch the green buds of new life and to bring in the rich harvests of your labour under the sun. She paused for a moment and was silent, almost as if there was something insidious that she didn't want to share with me. One of your biggest soul lessons in this incarnation is for you to listen to your intuition, because if you fail to do so, your life will be cut short. You can see on your hand a fork in the road, she said, pointing to 2 paths that meandered off my lifeline. It seems that you're afraid to listen to that inner voice, but not doing so will lead to your untimely death. Are you kidding? I'd said. Number 1, I would never be a farmer in a million years. And number 2, I'm quite sure I already listened to my intuition. I have to admit that extraordinary palm reading transpired over 10 years ago, and had almost been lost and forgotten in the recesses of my mind, gaining dust and cobwebs, and being remembered no more. That was until at 38 years old, I suddenly realised that I was indeed working the land and running my own farm. I mean, how did that even happen? It was exactly as Ella had described my life calling to be. It was hard to make any sense of her accuracy. I had fallen in love with a country girl called Patsy, and had moved into a cottage on her family's West Virginian farm. I had been instructed and coached by my wife's father on how to sow the seed, and just as Ella had predicted, I was never happier than when I worked the land with my disc plough and the sun beat upon my brow. Long gone were the days when I'd worked for my father's business, and I assure you, not for a second had I ever regretted leaving all that behind, as my life was so much richer, rewarding, and more edifying now. Naturally, my parents were not too pleased, and rather piqued and disgruntled with my decision to abandon my job in New York. But in truth, it was the best decision I had ever made, as I had never felt more appeased, contented, and satisfied with my life. Before long, my wife's parents took a back seat on the farm, and we reversed roles. They moved into the cottage, while my wife and I moved into their large farmhouse. I was doing the lion's share of the work on the land, and running things very efficiently and smoothly, with a feeling of incredible fulfilment and satisfaction. I had also learnt that my friend Tammy in England had listened to Ella and taken the bull by the horns, and was now running a very successful business in the Berkshire countryside, which was a delicatessen selling organic farm produce, from homemade butters to cheeses, honeys, milks, jams, organic meats, and everything like that. And she assured me that this was the best decision she had ever made, and she didn't miss the hustle and bustle of London at all. I was delighted that in the end she had also followed her passions. I feel so good, she told me, because I made it on my own without my father's help. And I knew exactly what she meant by that. The next part of my story begins when one day I decided to ride my horse Amelia Rose down some of those horse-riding trails in the countryside that were surrounded by elevated hilly embankments that were densely packed with bushy, resplendent trees, from oaks to hickories and pines, and there were clumps of moon daisies growing through the turf. All of a sudden this young girl came bolting out of the Frosty Meadows woods onto the riding trail, looking completely terrified. She kept looking back over her shoulders as if she was expecting something to follow her, giving me the sense that she was being pursued or chased by something or someone. The horror-struck look on her face melted away like butter when she saw me, and I discerned she was heartily relieved and comforted by my approach on horseback. She stood in the middle of the riding trail, oscillating her arms frantically, as if she was in serious trouble. I galloped over to her on my horse to see if she was all right. I suddenly recognised her as Farmer Beckett's older daughter, Scarlet. Without wasting any time, Scarlet literally climbed on the back of my saddle, holding tightly onto my back for dear life, and begging me to speed up. And so our miller Rose cantered out of the area as quickly as possible, until finally my horse was standing outside Scarlet's family farm gate, and she eagerly dismounted. I could discern by the discomposed expression on Scarlet's face that she was very anxious, perturbed, and unsettled. "Are you sure you're going to be all right?" I asked her. "I don't feel good leaving you like this. You look as if you've had really rather quite a shock." "I'll be fine," she assured me. "Thanks so much for the lift. I truly appreciate it." "What happened back there that made you so scared? Or don't you want to tell me about it?" I asked. "I'm not sure you'll believe me if I tell you," she said, "but I'll tell you anyway. I saw a Bigfoot back there, in the woods, and this thing was so enormous I nearly had a heart attack on the spot. Nothing could prepare me for how intimidating the creature was. I mean, I've seen documentaries about them before, but the size of this thing, it boggled my mind. I was so terrified." "You saw a Bigfoot?" I gasped. "Are those creatures even real?" I didn't think so before now, but having seen one larger than life, I have to conclude that they are indeed real, because I assure you my imagination was not playing tricks on me. I know exactly what I saw, and it was a male Bigfoot. "I believe you," I said. "What happened exactly?" "Well, I was going mushroom hunting in the woods. I was collecting some mushrooms, most particularly lion manes, to make a chicken and mushroom pie for dinner tonight, as we're celebrating my mother's birthday this evening. Anyway, as I was searching for the mushrooms, I got this airy, creepy feeling that something was watching me. And that was when I saw the Bigfoot. It wasn't even trying to hide from me. It wanted to be seen, which was exceedingly odd, given these creatures are naturally elusive by reputation. Well, that's what I've learnt. I promise you this thing made me feel like an ant. It was so colossal. Nothing has ever made me feel so vulnerable and small and inconspicuous in all my life. It was like facing a lion or any other remarkable predator." "Was the Bigfoot aggressive towards you?" I asked curiously. "I mean, did it growl or scream at you? What did it do to make you so petrified?" "I think the thing that scared me the most was the Bigfoot itself. The general appearance of the thing. It was so daunting. It wasn't even aggressive towards me, but it was acting very weird." "What was it doing?" I asked. "It kept pointing to the right-hand side of my head, as if to say there was something there, like a bug or something. But when I put my hand on my head, nothing was there. Over and over again, it kept pointing to the side of my head, and in my mind I'm almost sure I heard the words, 'Very bad, very bad.'" "Do you think he was communicating with you telepathically?" I asked. "I have no idea," said Scarlet, "and quite frankly I don't care. If I never see that monstrous thing ever again, it'll be far too soon. It scared the living daylights out of me, which is why I ran away as fast as I could. But I don't think it followed me." A week after I had rescued Scarlet on the back of my horse, my wife informed me that tragically Scarlet was found dead on her parents' farm, and it appeared from the coroner's report that she had died of a brain aneurysm that had occurred on the right-hand side of her head. I was devastated to hear the appalling news, and could not imagine the grief her family was going through. I did wonder if it was a coincidence that a Bigfoot whom had made his presence known to Scarlet while she was mushroom hunting in the woods, and had acted strangely by constantly pointing to the right-hand side of her head, whether by any chance he had tried to warn her about her brain aneurysm. I had heard of dogs that could detect cancer in human beings. Was it possible that the Bigfoot had discerned her brain aneurysm and was trying to warn her of her problem? In my opinion, this was more than likely. After doing some research on the subject of Bigfoot, my curiosity got the better of me, and I was intrigued and determined to search for the creature. So 4 weeks after Scarlett's tragic demise, I retraced her footsteps and ambled into the frosty meadow woods, hoping to encounter a Bigfoot. My wife had given me a basket for picking some wild mushrooms, as I had not revealed to her my real motives for visiting the woods. I carried a high-caliber rifle under my arms for self-defence, and was beginning to feel rather foolish, because I could see that this search was indeed futile. Who was I kidding? Did I really think I would randomly encounter a Bigfoot just by chance? How many people in North America had scoured the forest aimlessly in pursuit of this illusory creature with little success? Yet I had the presumptuous audacity to believe that a brief encounter in the woods with this ambiguous creature would be fruitful. Was I completely off my trolley? It was a beautiful summer's day, and the woods were alive with exquisite birdsong, and the tall statuesque trees with their masterful trunks towered up into the heavens like vertical towers, and the rocky ground covered in voluptuous boulders and pretty lacy ferns looked so arresting, and was only enhanced by the natural soft light from the canopy that dappled the floor in an ethereal luminescence. I noted everything was covered in resplendent layers of velvety moss, and before long I began to gather some mushrooms, as I knew my wife loved lion manes, and there were dozens of them growing all over the woods. I dutifully obliged my wife by piling my basket with all these fabulous edibles, and was about to leave when I suddenly sensed that everything had become alarmingly quiet, and even the bird song had receded and dissipated. It was like the woods were alive with the sound of silence. I had the distinct impression that I was being watched and scrutinized by a pair of unseen eyes. I knew that this meant the Bigfoot could be around, but I wasn't prepared for the nervous anxiety that completely overcame me. I needed to get out of the Frosty Meadows woods right now if I had any common sense at all. I began to walk speedily through the wood green, glancing over my shoulders nervously to check if I was being followed. I was so terrified. I realized that the last thing I wanted was to see a Bigfoot after all. Let's face it, a man is entitled to change his mind about such things. All of a sudden my eyes were drawn to some shrubbery that was twitching and ominously moving backwards like a curtain being drawn, and stepping through this dense foliage I beheld a creature so massive and intimidating that in my astonishment I dropped my basket of mushrooms on the ground. The creature just stood there staring at me for a moment, and it was as if time stood still, for every single second lasted an entire lifetime. All I could feel was the thunderous beats of my heart pounding violently in my chest, and an icy chill travelled down my spine like a cold Arctic wind. "Run! Run! Run!" were the words that screamed through my mind, inviting me to obediently rise to the urgent call. But it would seem that my physical body refused to cooperate or respond to my brain's frantic commands. "Run! Run! Run!" My mind screamed again, but I was unable to move. The Bigfoot stepped out of the shadows, meandering towards me on a pair of very powerful legs, and stopping only a couple of yards from where I was standing. And he was so close that I could hear his heavy breathing. He sounded exactly like a horse. The critter's pyramid-shaped head and shoulders swiveled towards me, and he looked directly at me with deep-set, dark eyes that seemed kind and congenial, not aggressive or threatening as I had anticipated. If you were to ask me to describe the creature to you, I would say that the gargantuan size of the Bigfoot was not something I was prepared for, as it was easily 8 foot tall and between 600 to 700 pounds. Its whole body was covered in long flowing dark hair that was much less dense under the armpits and around the knee area, and the body was so powerful and strong, with a barrel-shaped chest and massive shoulders upon which the head was attached, without any discernible neck to speak of, but the face on the creature was remarkably and alarmingly human. The creature moved towards me, and I could smell the scent of wet moss, and it touched my chest with its hands, and in that moment my fear accelerated like the engine of a car, but I simply could not run. The creature kept pointing towards my chest again and again and again, and made a chattering sound. It then just turned around and glided away, and was gone from my sight. For a second I stood there like a lemon, feeling so perturbed and confused. What was that all about? And why did the creature keep pointing to my chest? It was all too similar to the time when Scarlett had encountered a Bigfoot who had pointed to the right-hand side of her head, and a week later she had died of a brain aneurysm. Something in my gut told me to pay attention. You may wonder why some people sit on their Bigfoot secrets for many long years, sometimes never telling a solitary soul about their encounter, and now I truly understand why. I assure you, it takes a great deal of time to come to terms with such an outlandish interaction, and sometimes you find yourself replaying what happened in your mind over and over again, and wondering, did I really see that? Sometimes you can even doubt yourself, and your memory can become almost dreamlike. For a long time I told no one about what had happened to me, but as the Bigfoot made such a big deal about my chest area, I instinctively sensed that I needed to get my chest checked out. I thought back to the palm reader who had told me to listen to my instincts or my life could be shortened, and that rang warning bells in my head. When I told my doctor that I wanted him to give me a CT scan of my chest, he thought I was crazy. "You don't smoke, nor do you have any problems with your lungs," he had said to me. "Why do you need the scan?" I persuaded him to humour me, and he was astounded to find a small cancerous mass on my lungs, of an aggressive cancer that could easily have killed me within the next year. But due to the early diagnosis, I am now cancer-free, and it's all thanks to a palm reader in England who told me to listen to my instincts or my life would be cut short, and to a Bigfoot who alerted me to my problem. If there's any moral to this story, I'd like to suggest that you always listen to your gut instincts and that you don't piggyback your way to success on somebody else's wings. Well, not if you want to find out what you alone are capable of. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I have sat on my story for far too long, incubating it much like a hen on an egg, and hoping it would never hatch, for I never thought I'd ever speak of it again. It is not a story that I've ever shared with anyone, not because I give a toss about being ridiculed by strangers having a laugh at my expense, for I don't care about all that stuff. Never have and never will. But some things happen in our lives that are deeply personal to us, and these secrets become such an intrinsic part of our beings, much like the rings on the trunk of a tree, denoting its age. And sometimes those secrets go down to the grave with us when we have departed from this earth. However, I think this extraordinary story about a mysterious forbidden love, a Bigfoot and a tragedy is well worth telling and deserves to be brought out into the full light of day. My name is Pierce, and I grew up in the North American countryside, but I would prefer not to be specific about the geographical coordinates, only for the protection of my sister Evelyn, who was not eager for me to share our story in the first place, unless of course I kept her out of the picture as much as I possibly could. We both grew up in a gorgeous old-fashioned vintage-style double-storey farmhouse with my parents that had belonged to several generations on my mother's side of the family. She had inherited this house from a great-uncle of hers who had always regarded her as much like his daughter. My mother was a country girl at heart, so when she married my father, who came from a long line of cattle ranchers, it was hardly a surprise that our farm was finally transformed into a sizable cattle ranch, and my father purchased the adjoining farm to enhance its size, so that it blossomed and flourished into a sizable ranch. As young teenagers in the early 80s, my parents gave us free rein to do as we pleased, as in those days people were far less worried about crime than they are now. We could literally cycle outside our farm gate, down some of those rugged, gravelly country roads to our heart's content, and go exploring. In truth, we loved nothing better than riding past cows and horses grazing in the rich, undulating, luxuriant, emerald-green pastures, while the soft shafts of sunlight bespeckled our faces with a cosy warmth. My parents didn't want us to prospect or investigate the old abandoned farmhouse further along the country track, situated at the end of a large cul-de-sac, where it stood like a lonely, old, neglected lady, covered in cobwebs and dust, abandoned and forsaken by all those who had loved her once. For indeed she was a sorrowful, woe-begotten sight, with white wooden windows falling apart and crumbling at the seams, and rambunctious creepers curling, twining, and pushing forcefully through the cracks with a pertinacious vigour and enthusiasm of note. The faded white brick walls were now peeling, and the dog-eared roof looked like it had seen much better days. The house had been pretty once, of that I am sure, for despite the passing of years, the remnants of its charming character were fighting through the degraded, run-down remains of this decrepit building, crying out to be seen, almost as if to say, "I really am worth saving. Please don't overlook me." This once imposing farmhouse, only a shadow of its former glory, appeared to be surrounded by the prettiest statuesque woodland trees, from oaks to maples and hickories. Then close to the house was an enchanting creek that was arched by a decaying bridge that was in even more appalling state than the house itself. If you think for a moment that my sister and I were obedient to my father asking us to avoid the old abandoned farmhouse, you would be very wrong. We were not rebellious or incompliant by any manner of means, but growing up when my parents told us to keep our hands out of the cookie jar, it would seem that the jar of cookies became utterly irresistible. And just like bees to a honey pot, our willpower completely waned, and we couldn't but help ourselves from diving in and stealing a few cookies. It would have worked so much better for my parents to use reverse psychology and to tell us to spend our days at the neglected farmhouse, or to eat as many cookies as we liked. And I guarantee you this, they would have certainly lost their appeal. One day my sister and I wilfully defied all our promises, and we surreptitiously hid our bicycles behind a couple of thorny briars to ensure that no one could possibly know we were at this farmhouse, because we knew if our father found out about our impudent disobedience, we would be in a whole heap of trouble, and it wasn't pretty when my dad lost his temper. We cautiously ventured towards the old farmhouse, and for a moment we stood still, surveying the building intently, for despite its appalling state, it stood proud and tall, refusing to be ashamed or humiliated by her dilapidated, ramshackled state. "It's so sad," I said to my sister, eyeing the farmhouse. "At one time this place was quite magnificent, I'm sure of that. I would buy it myself in a heartbeat if I had the money. Why would someone just forsake it like this? It seems almost cruel." "It's only a house, Piers," said my sister. "Why do you have to be so dramatic about bricks and mortar, for goodness sake? Mummy told me that the people who lived here all of a sudden just moved to New York, and their son joined the Navy. Everyone at the time thought it was very strange, because the family was exceedingly happy and very loved by the community. The father ran a cattle ranch here, but he sold off the large herd and abandoned the land just like that. I mean, who does that?" "But why?" I said. "Why would they allow their house to fall to rack and ruin like this? It seems nonsensical to me. They could have at least sold it, and they would have got a pretty penny for it, I'm sure." "Don't ask me," said Evelyn. "People can do the strangest things sometimes, but I'm sure they must have had their good reasons. Maybe they were planning to come back, but just never did." As we entered the forsaken house, I was surprised to see that it was still furnished, and it would seem thick layers of dust and silken cobwebs swathed the furnishings with their lustrous, feathery fibres, and much of the once very opulent upholstery had been ravaged and devoured by moths, and was now almost completely threadbare. The kitchen fridge contained bottles of pickles, with best before dates in the early 70s. Everything smelt musty like mildew or damp, and the old wooden floors buckled beneath our feet, creaking as we cautiously glided up the staircase to the upstairs bedrooms, where the large beds were still dressed in their sheets, that were now covered in thick layers of dirt, where we could see the footprints of raccoons that had clearly explored the house on an investigation of their own. I discovered a whole stack of old birthday cards lying in a wastepaper basket in the main bedroom, and some of them seemed to have been shredded, almost like someone had wanted to dispose of them very quickly. One card had escaped the shredding, and I curiously opened it and began to read it out aloud to my sister. "To my beloved, precious sister, you are the light of my life and the joy in my heart, and the purpose of my every breath. Have a wonderful birthday, sweetie pie. All my love, your devoted brother Paul. That's way too over the top, I said. I do love you, Evelyn, but I would never describe you as the light of my life. That's way too intense for me. Thanks a lot, said Evelyn. So what am I to you then? Well, you're not the light of my life, that's for sure. I hope that position will be reserved for my wife one day, but you are one of my best friends in the whole world. Thanks, said Evelyn. That actually means a lot. You're also my best friend, but light of my life, you most certainly are not, she teased. It's weird, I said. This birthday card kind of creeps me out a bit. It's what you'd expect to write to your lover, not a sister, don't you think? Maybe they were just exceptionally close, said Evelyn. That's what I concluded, I said, but not close in a natural or normal way, I'm inclined to think. I don't know what it was about this mysterious, alluring farmhouse, but it would seem that my sister and I were so fascinated and intrigued by it, and were drawn to it regularly, as if in some way we had an invisible connection to the bricks and mortar of the house, or the house in some way had a kind of magical magnetic hold over us. One day, as we were exploring the abandoned farmhouse, we could hear footsteps coming towards the house. It was odd because we hadn't heard a car driving down the long gravelly drive, with the treading sound of crushed stones usually being heard so eloquently, as it swivelled or braked in the parking bay. Hide, I said to my sister. Someone's coming. Quick! I think it's Dad. If he sees us here, we're dead, I said, moving my hand quickly across my throat to indicate a slit throat. But where can we hide? Whispered my sister, looking around the bedroom with a frantic expression on her face. She did not fancy facing the wrath of my father, who could bellow like an ox. Behind the sofa, I said, and we bolted behind the sizable piece of furniture, our hearts thundering through our chests and our brows sweating profusely. Please, God, don't let Dad find us here, I thought. He'll kill us. I did not mean that literally, of course, but my father was not a man whose feathers you intentionally ruffled. That is, if you did not want to get on his wrong side, of course. We could hear these heavy, cloddish, thumping footsteps climbing the steps rather clumsily, and a male voice kept saying, "Damn! Damn!" I imagine the stranger had managed to get their ungainly shoe trapped into a warped piece of the staircase, which was exceedingly easy to do. And this person, whoever they were, appeared to be as graceless and blundering as a bull in a china shop. "It's not Daddy," I whispered to my sister. "It's someone else." Whoever this oafish person was, they appeared to be dragging something up the staircase with heavy hands, making several grunts and groans in the process, as if it was a laborious job. But the staircase was tricky, given its decrepit state, and so mastering it was tantamount to balancing on a tightrope, and carrying something, whether heavy or light, was in fact a monumental, arduous and gruelling challenge. Whoever this man was, he appeared to lift a long vertical-shaped bubble-wrap parcel into his arms that had been taped together with duct tape. We could hear his footsteps entering the bedroom, and then he threw the mysterious parcel onto the bed, where it bounced for a second and finally settled on the mattress. My sister kept poking me because I was having a very good look at the stranger, and she was absolutely terrified that I would be observed by him. I noted he was quite short, with a slim build, and he looked like he was in his 30s. We could hear the sound of duct tape being pulled away from the bubble wrap, and the bubble wrap was thrown onto the ground like old Christmas paper, while the whole room was enveloped in a vile, putrid smell that was so disgusting my sister and I were trying desperately hard not to throw up or gag, but after a while, I'm glad to say, the smell settled. Whatever the man had brought into the room, it was clearly something that was dead. At first I thought he'd brought an animal from a taxidermist or something, as they can smell rather funky. All of a sudden the man began to talk. I think he was lying on the bed next to the open parcel and holding it closely to his body, which was disgusting, because whatever it was, it most certainly did not smell great. The man began to talk lovingly to the parcel. "Why, oh why, sister, did you make me do this? You know how much I loved you. We were meant to be together forever. You agreed to that. Remember our pinky promise. I always told you that if I could not have you, no one could. Why? Why did it have to end this way? Things could have been so different for the both of us. We had our dreams. Don't you remember our dreams? But you ruined everything. Why did you have to listen to Mum? Why did you have to listen to Dad? They didn't understand our love. Why? Why did you listen to them? So what if we couldn't have had our own children together? Big deal. We could have adopted or worked out some other plan. We could have disappeared into the sunset together. No one would have ever found us. You knew that I was never, ever going to let you marry that loser. That loser. Oh, that big loser. I wouldn't let that happen. Not in a million years. If I can't have you, then no one can. Remember, that was our deal. We could hear the man sobbing and sobbing for a long time, until he had soaked the dusty sheets with his salty tears. The man then finally composed himself and gathered the bubble wrap and pieces of duct tape in his hands and walked rather precariously down the decrepit staircase, emitting a few more damns in the process, as invariably he kept getting his boots stuck in the buckling wood. Finally we could hear a car engine starting up and the car wheels crunching the pebbles beneath the tyres until finally it had driven away. My sister and I were so astonished. We could see on the bed there was a body of a young woman that almost appeared mummified, as the skin was so tightly attached to the face that it had an appearance much like tanned leather, and the body looked shriveled, withered and dried up, like a sun-dried wrinkled prune. It was clear to see that the young woman, who looked like a leather doll, had been dead for a very long time. Luckily she did not smell as bad as she could have done, as her dehydrated body was quite literally fossilized, like a hard stone, which meant it may have been kept in a very dry, closed environment for quite some while. "What the heck?" I said to my sister, looking at her in outright horror. "Do you realise what's going on here? I think that young man used to live in this house, and this dead body is his sister. I think he was so in love with her, and he couldn't bear for her to marry anyone else, so he killed her and brought her back to his childhood home." "Why would he bring her back here?" asked Evelyn. "That's completely crazy." "I don't know, but he clearly was madly in love with her," I said. "But why would he kill his sister?" protested Evelyn. "That doesn't make any sense at all." Love can do strange things to people, and even make them behave completely out of character. It might explain why this whole family abandoned their home. "Think about it." "What do you mean?" asked my sister. "Well, supposing the parents discovered what was actually going on under their own roof. I mean, consider all the ramifications. Think about all those shredded birthday cards in the bin that someone angrily ripped apart, possibly in disgusted revulsion, which may have been a dismayed, very aggrieved parent, appalled to see that their own son was writing lovey-dovey stuff to his own sister. I think the parents must have been completely devastated to discover that their own two children were in love with each other. How did they handle such a horrifying revelation? It would have been a shameful disgrace for a family to have to contend with such an insidious, dark secret that literally had the potential to rip the family apart. "Oh, I see what you're getting at," said my sister. "I think I know why they left this house. They probably persuaded the son to go to the Navy to get him out of the way, and as far from the sister as possible. And then the rest of the family decided to move to New York, possibly hoping that the son would not find their brand new address, as they wanted to separate their children from each other for as long as possible. They possibly hoped that the distance between their two children would bring them both to their senses and encourage them to start dating other people." "Good point, Evelyn. You're on to something there, I think. I'm sure the brother returned from the Navy and discovered to his horror that his beloved, precious sister, the love of his life, was getting married to someone else. He couldn't bear the idea of her belonging to another man, so he managed to meet up with her in secret and probably tried to persuade her to run away with him, and she refused to go, so he killed her." "That's exactly what I think," said my sister. "Jealousy. It's a lethal killer." As my sister and I were locked in a deep discussion over this mysterious, idiosyncratic and unorthodox case, all of a sudden we heard a loud thumping noise, and we were convinced that the young man was coming back, although I had not heard a car engine purring down the driveway, nor had I heard gravel being crunched under heavy tyres, or car doors being opened and slammed. But who else could it be? Perhaps he decided to come back and pick up the corpse after all. "Quick, hide!" I whispered to my sister. "Quick!" Whoever was coming up the steps had a very noticeable, hefty, but smooth, fluent and springy footfall. And whoever they were, they seemed unusually nimble and agile on their feet, as if the dilapidated staircase was of little consequence or hindrance to them. The next thing we knew was that this huge presence burst forth into the room, and even hiding behind the large sofa, my sister and I could perceive this formidable, intimidating aura literally envelop the entire room in a powerful, daunting and imposing energy of the likes that I've never beheld before. Even the room was filled with the warm, nutty aroma and buttery vanilla notes I have often discerned with acorn and oak trees. I could feel my body heating up as the sweat began to pour down my face, and my heart was thundering violently through my chest like a heavy drum. I could feel, sense, and even taste danger in every fibre of my being. I was almost too terrified to take a peek at this strange, extraordinary, mysterious entity in the room, but my curiosity overcame my rising trepidation, and I peeked over the settee, and what I saw was so outlandish and nonsensical that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up on end, and I broke out into goosebumps all over my skin. What on earth was this strange critter, I wondered, for in all my born days I had never encountered something like this before. It was easily about 7 foot tall and 600 pounds, with a large barrel chest and very powerful shoulders, and what was incredible was the creature was covered from top to bottom in chestnut-coloured hair, and based on the thickness and texture of the hair from the back view, it could have easily been confused with a bear, but a bear it most certainly was not. I could discern that the creature was built very much like a human being, but with gargantuan, giant-like proportions. Its overlong, strong arms and the distinct arched shape of its head were about the only features that differed from being entirely human. But minus those discrepancies, the creature was almost perfectly human, although at this stage I hadn't observed the face. It appeared to be hovering over the corpse of the young girl, and was very vocal in expressing his apparent dismay and consternation. It began to almost howl in despairing dismay, and even began beating its chest, as if the death of this withered corpse had caused him some personal distress. If I had not known any better, I could swear that this creature had known the young woman in life, for he was exhibiting the very signs of someone experiencing a desperate, overwhelming grief upon hearing some tragic news. The critter lifted up the hardened corpse and threw it over his shoulders like a sack of potatoes, and was about to turn around when my sister unexpectedly coughed. In that moment I wanted to throttle her, never more so than I did just then, as we were sitting ducks for this treacherous predator. The creature looked stunned and bewildered, and immediately glided over to where we were hiding, pulling back the couch and sliding it across the floor to expose our cowering, pathetic bodies. In that moment the fear I felt was overwhelming, and I was so frozen in terror as the creature studied us curiously through his deep-set dark eyes. I think Evelyn and I were the last things he had expected to see, and his expression seemed nonplussed, as if he was saying, "What are you doing here, and who on earth are you?" The critter did not display any animosity or aggression towards us, but in no way did that reassure or comfort our fear, as we were overcome with such a senseless, tangible terror that it seemingly incapacitated our ability to move. I just stared at the creature with eyes as round as saucers and my jaw hanging wide open. My sister was equally as debilitated and immobilized by what we were both perceiving. For this creature, whatever in God's name it was, did not conform to our understanding of the natural world. It was like some strange, spurious beast had literally entered our reality from some other unknown dimension or open portal. But this was not the case, for this prodigious, uncustomary creature was as real as you or I. The creature turned around with the dead corpse still dangling over his shoulder like a stiff rag doll. He dashed down the stairs and glided out of the house and was gone from our sight. "What the heck?" I said to my sister. "Did you see that?" "Did I see that?" said my sister. "Are you kidding? Of course I saw that. What was it? And why did it want that dead, dried-up old corpse? I mean, it's hardly edible. It would be like gnarling on leather, cardboard or stone. I mean, if he tried to eat her." "I don't think that's his intention," I piped. "Did you not see how gutted he was about her dead body? It was almost as if he knew the girl personally, as if he'd had some kind of friendship with her. He appeared distressed by her death. This whole situation is completely bizarre. If I didn't know any better, I would assume we were playing a part in a movie." As you can imagine, my sister and I were dumbfounded by our unprecedented, momentous experience, as we could not comprehend what we had both seen. We had observed a dead body being dumped on a bed by a young girl's own brother, who we believed had killed his sister in an act of passionate jealousy, as he could not bear for her to be without another man. Maybe he wanted her body to be recovered at his old family home, so the family could have a decent burial. But it would seem that the epic, anomalous creature we had encountered had other ideas in mind for the corpse, as he had glided off with it in his arms. We naturally did not tell our parents what we had seen at the abandoned house, because we knew we would be in serious trouble for going there in the first place, and besides, I seriously doubt they would have ever believed our outrageous, implausible and fantastical claims or allegations about a hairy humanoid stealing the dead corpse from the farmhouse. Every way you looked at it, our story seemed preposterous and spectacularly bizarre. One day I actually heard from my mother that the 2 children who'd grown up in the old abandoned farmhouse had been registered as missing, presumed dead. No one knew what had happened to the young girl, but her brother on one of his Navy missions had disappeared off the ship, and many believed he'd jumped into the sea, as he was described as suffering from bouts of deep depression and grievous despair that no amount of medication could suppress. It was weird to think that my sister and I were privy to what really happened to the young girl, but we never ever told anyone. We could only conclude that the brother, in his remorseful grief about what he'd done to his sister, could not live with the guilt any more, and had chosen to end his own life. It really was a tragic love story of 2 people who could not be together as lovers because they were siblings with an unsanctioned, taboo and prohibited love. Fast forward to the late 90s, and I was now a married man with 2 young children of my own, and believe it or not, I decided to buy the old farmhouse that had stood neglected for so long. Even my wife, who was not privy to the story connected to the old house, could see its hidden potential and promise. "It's a real beauty," she had said, "and once this place is fixed up, this house will be a showstopper," and believe me, she was not wrong. Before long we'd restored the old abandoned farmhouse back to its former glory, and it was like a bedraggled, dying rose that began to blossom and bud again. Once again she stood proud and tall in the countryside, knowing that she was every bit as magnificent as she had been in her former days, when the first bricks of her foundations were ever laid. All the peeling paint and cracked walls were no longer, and were replaced with a rich gleaming coat of fresh white paint, and the old decrepit wooden windows had been replaced with brand new ones. Our fields had been enriched with healthy soil, and we had cattle now grazing the rich verdant pastures, and even the little creek was now covered with a brand new arch bridge. Many locals in the area who observed our brand new home regretted that they had not snapped up the property for themselves, for they could see she was an exceptional home. Dare I say, even my father was impressed. "Son, you have done incredibly well for yourself," he had said. "I had my misgivings about this place, but I can see I was very wrong." From the moment we moved into our home, we could hear ethereal female laughter, but we could never determine where it came from. We still hear it to this very day. But on one occasion when it was very late in the evening, I saw a pretty girl who was wearing bell-bottom jeans and a loose cotton shirt running down our staircase. I promise you that she was so real that I actually thought I was seeing things. She looked up and smiled directly at me, with sparkling blue eyes, and then she ran outside the house. I immediately ran after her into the open meadow where the cattle were grazing, who looked up at me in surprise, wondering what their owner was doing, running in the middle of the meadow like a bat out of hell. For this girl, she ran faster than the wind. But then she turned around, glanced at me over her shoulder, smiled at me, and vanished before my very eyes. The next thing I knew was I was surrounded by several inquisitive cattle, eager to know what the heck was going on, as they were exceedingly inquisitive critters. I was soon to realize that the ghost of the young girl had been seen by many in my family, including our local electrician, who was visiting our house once and said to me, "You have a pretty daughter out there. It's a long time since I've seen anybody wear bell-bottom jeans before. Maybe she will renew the old fashion." I thought better than to tell him that he'd actually seen a ghost. I do not get the sense she's trapped here, but I know who she is, and I think she's happy. It's her laughter that I hear, and I think it holds many happy memories for her, this home I mean. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.